I am Louis XIV. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 76, The City That Never Sleeps. To show his respect and love for the lady, the king took her hand and walked into the hall first, followed by the Queen Mother and Cardinal Mazarin. Behind them came Queen Mary of England and Princess Henrietta. Princess Henrietta was held by the hand by Philip, Duke of Anjou. Then came the princes, nobles, civil and military ministers. They followed the king in an orderly and solemn manner, holding hands in rows of two, like a group of dogs following their master. As soon as the king entered the hall, the band began to play music. It was a lively adaptation of a Swedish folk song, which made Lady Christina smile. The chairs and long tables in the hall had already been arranged. According to the king's request, in addition to the snow-white linen tablecloths, there were countless flowers. They were either spread in the corners like cushions, or hung from a corner of the ceiling like curtains. The table was covered with silver and white porcelain tableware, and the flowers on the table were placed in crystal bottles. Although it was not yet late at night, the servants had already lit the candles, and the reflected light from them brightened people's eyes. As for the white, silver and gold plates, they were already piled high with candied fruits and pastries, and the jars and pots were almost overflowing with coffee, juice and honey water. The hot ones were emitting wisps of white steam, and the same was true for the ice ones. In front of the king's brother, the Queen Mother and the bishop, Queen Mary and Princess Henrietta of England, and today's guests, there was a beautiful statue. Lady Christina looked at it for a long time before she was sure that it was carved from solidified snow-white powdered sugar. Of course, this was not all. The dishes for tonight had been prepared since 4 in the morning. By now, some guests could almost smell the rich aroma of the delicious food that was about to be prepared, which made them feel that the pre-meal prayer was too long. Fortunately, before their stomachs started to call out, the soups were served. There were 3 thick soups and 1 clear soup. The thick soup was sea fish soup and partridge soup. Then there was a double flavor soup. Quail and beef were stewed together, and then eggs, vegetables and salt were added, and precious spices such as cinnamon, pepper and cloves were sprinkled in. The clear soup was mushroom cream soup. Although the taste of this soup was rich enough in the eyes of people today, since there was no meat, it was a clear soup. But the king ordered the chef to cover it with a puff pastry hat, which was something that the French or people in other places had not been able to eat yet. They watched the king's actions carefully, imitating the king to tear the puff pastry into pieces and then put it into the soup to eat together. After the soup came the main course: stewed lamb legs, honey steamed ham, roasted venison loin, pheasant stuffed with chestnuts, etc., one after another, each with a different taste and exceptionally delicious. Although at such a banquet, people could not help but whisper to each other to process the information they had, but after the soup, few people could speak anymore. Their tongues were almost filled with these rare delicacies, and even the ladies who valued their figure kept asking for more dishes. After the main course came the vegetables: Parisian chicory, white asparagus, artichokes, parsnips, radishes, cabbage, Cyprus cauliflower, Italian onions and spiny thistles. Some were fresh, some were pickled or processed in other ways, but all were clean and refreshing, sweeping away the greasiness brought by the main course. And after the vegetables came the fruits and boiled eggs, which were to ensure that some guests with big appetites would fill up. But today, even if a giant dragon came, Louis believed that it had been fed. But when seeing those colorful fruits with water drops, some people still couldn't help but take them in their hands to play with them. Because of the season, the fresh fruits were mainly apples and some berries. There were 3 kinds of apples: spotted apples, purple apples and small red apples. They were served on silver plates. There were also cherry and peach pies, various jams, etc. The wines on the table came from Champagne and Burgundy. All the Burgundy wines were presented to the king by the Duchess of Montpensier for use in this banquet. This sumptuous dinner lasted for 3 hours. At the end, everyone was eager to go out for a walk. There were special servants who took them to secret rooms, so they enjoyed the beautiful scenery that could not be seen anywhere else. From the bottom of his heart, Louis felt that after dinner, it would be most comfortable to take a walk alone or read quietly in the study. Unfortunately, it was not possible. After the banquet, he was most eager to see the scene he saw. He invited Mrs. Christina to a terrace in the northeast corner of the Louvre, from which you can see a sparkling canal. Next to the canal is the Red Children Market, and to the right you can see Notre Dame, and next to Notre Dame is the Place de la Bastille. Vauban, standing on the bell tower of Notre Dame, had been holding a telescope nervously, with a piece of stuffed bread that he had only taken 2 bites of beside him. The tower was extremely cold in early autumn, but even so he did not dare to drink a few sips of wine to keep warm. As soon as he saw the king appear on the terrace, surrounded by countless ministers, he immediately ran over to pull out the torch and shook it vigorously at the people under the bell tower. Several horses galloped out from under the bell tower quickly, one street after another. The riders had whistles in their mouths, and the sharp whistles swept through people's ears like the wind, so the people waiting by the oil lamps immediately lit the lamps and hung them high on the lampposts. These lampposts had been seen by people for a long time, but at that time they only used them as flagpoles or for other purposes. Until now, under the dark sky, countless lights illuminated the streets and alleys of Paris as if to seize the light of the stars in the sky. They clearly outlined each street. Residents were no longer trapped in their houses. They walked out of their homes and looked at the light brought by the king with joy. Then they were surprised to find that under the order of the king and the bishop, almost all shops began to open at night. The candles in the glass windows made the storefronts brilliant. The shopkeepers were reluctant at first, but later they found that under the beautification of the warm yellow light, even the inferior goods showed different colors or textures from the daytime. Some customers who were misled by their own vision foolishly bought a lot of goods that they disdained when the light was sufficient, so they became particularly sincere when shouting "Long live the king." Of course, the cheers of 1 or 2 people could not be heard on the tower of the Louvre, but the people here could clearly see the scenery below. In this era, people with only candles and grease lighting could only feel the difference in the night during religious festivals. Even in Paris, the night was still dangerous, dull and boring, but now, like turning the spring of a toy box, all the people inside moved. The deep black night and the golden streets gave this ancient city a unique beauty, and everyone was conquered. "This is only the first day," they heard the king say. "It will be like this every day after that." He turned and proudly declared, "This will be a city that never sleeps." Some people may wonder why Louis held such a grand banquet and carried out such a huge project when the treasury was empty, and even borrowed money to maintain the army and government operations. But in the 17th century, this was the most common way for noble princes to demonstrate their power. Endless, unrestrained and careless spending and extravagance will make your friends happy, make your enemies shrink, and make those greedy businessmen scramble to qualify to lend you money. No kidding, that's it. They would rather lend money to a lord who spends 1,000 livres on shoes every day than to a starving person who urgently needs 10 riots for a piece of bread. The king also took great pains to host this banquet. The palace was decorated with so many flowers because there was a shortage of velvet and gold foil to decorate the walls. Some tableware was even borrowed from the bishop's palace and some merchants. The curtains and tablecloths of the entire Louvre and half of the Tuileries Palace, candles and charcoal were all concentrated in the hall in a few rooms. When people were exclaiming in joy for the light on the streets, most of Paris was still immersed in darkness. This was also a declaration of strength to France's allies and enemies. At least for the envoys of other countries, they would describe the banquet in detail in their letters to knights so that their kings could carefully consider their attitude towards the young new king of France. As for the ministers and judges, at least at this moment, they were convinced by their king. They couldn't even hold back their excitement and whispered to each other before the king left. But this was exactly what Louis wanted to see. When he left the hall, everyone bowed and sent him off until his figure disappeared behind the door. Only Bonhomme, the king's trusted chamberlain, could see the king's fatigue. Louis simply washed up and went to bed, missing a visit from Prince Theodoric of Van Zug. Chapter 77, Reconstruction of the Three Palaces, recommended by Samjiang. The next day, the king went to see the Queen Mother. This was not something every son or king would do, but out of Louis's heart, he would still go to pray with his mother every morning. If there was an emergency, he would postpone it, which undoubtedly consolidated and improved the status of the Queen Mother. After all, after Louis came of age, many people were speculating whether the young king would be dissatisfied with the Queen Mother's constraints on the king in the past few years, especially when Bishop Mazarin was gradually making concessions. But the king's actions told them that he still respected his mother very much, which once again eliminated the intrigues in the court. This was exactly what Louis needed: stability. Stability. He needed time, compared to the space to show his hands and feet, a long term, Peaceful and stable Paris was the foundation of his rule. But today, after the prayer, the Queen Mother did not get up immediately. She gently placed her hand on her eldest son's hand and looked at him with gentle and kind eyes. Louis found that he inherited much more from the Queen Mother than his father, Louis XIV. No wonder some people have always questioned his bloodline with Philip. Louis XIV was not ugly, and could even be said to be gentle and refined. But Louis and Philip could be said to be a pair of handsome men, but Louis was more masculine, while Philip was more feminine. In other words, Philip's appearance was due to Bishop Mazarin and the Queen Mother. But no one could deny that their looks, whether when they were young or now, far surpassed those of their uncles, nephews, and even sisters. "Mother, Your Majesty," the Queen Mother said softly, "starting tomorrow, I will be the one to greet you." Louis couldn't help but show a look of surprise when he heard this. "Did anyone say anything?" "No," said the Queen Mother, "this is my decision, Your Majesty." She stretched out her hand and stroked her son's face. "There cannot be two suns in the sky, my dear king, and there cannot be two voices in the court. Before it was your father, and now it is you, Louis XIV. Starting from me, everyone should bow their heads and listen to your voice. You don't have to be so anxious. Now is the time," said the Queen Mother. "Paris was so beautiful last night, Your Majesty, I love it. In the court, no matter how small the matter is, it will evolve into a huge wave, let alone such a big move." Louis' servants and confidants soon discovered that although their previous orders were not unpracticable, they were not as smooth as the current ones. Even the king's religious teacher, Dean Riviere, told the king that he had gotten a better room with a view of the Seine and Notre Dame. The king just smiled at this. He was not going to move the positions of these experienced servants and stewards in the palace for the time being. Although, with them, the operation of the palace could continue smoothly, it was precisely because of them that some old customs and habits could not be erased. When Philip, Duke of Anjou, was tidying up the room to deal with those private issues, there were even people who tried to enrich themselves or use the power in their hands to obstruct it. Of course, these people are now in the Bastille fortress. The Bastille will not become a prison until about 100 years later, but the king does not mind putting it into use early. Perhaps the Queen Mother realized this and transferred the management of the palace from herself to Louis, but Louis soon handed it over to his brother Philip, who still lived with the Queen Mother. If Philip had anything he couldn't handle, he could immediately ask his mother for help, and the Queen Mother wouldn't be depressed because of the sudden idleness. There were usually only two ways for women in the palace to pass the time. One was gambling, and the other was attending mass, both of which were enough to make the Queen Mother's money pour out like water. The king would not covet his mother's money, but the money could obviously be used in better places, such as renovating the Louvre, the Tuileries Palace, and the Richelieu House. Bishop Mazarin recommended an architect to Louis, Louis XIV. Yes, another Louis, but from now on we can all call him Mr. XIV. Mr. XIV was pale and slightly swollen, with black curly hair draped from the top of his head to both sides. To be honest, the bangs on his forehead were a bit sparse. Fortunately, he was neither an actor nor a singer, and the king had no requirements for his appearance, but he was still a little hesitant about the king's request. It was not surprising that the king asked them to renovate the residence in the palace. The problem was that he required each suite to be equipped with a bathroom. Of course, this was a euphemism. In fact, it was a room equipped with a series of cleaning equipment from bathrooms to toilets. If you just calculate from the rooms and area, it is not difficult to do this. At most, some nobles will move out of the Louvre, which is not a big problem. The previous rebellion of Prince Condé and Duke of Gaston left many rooms empty. XIV heard that some people submitted applications impatiently, but the king has been slow to approve it. I think it was because of this. The most critical issue is the water supply and drainage required by the king. In 17th century Paris, there were no well-connected water pipes or anything similar, and people's understanding of water resources was extremely shallow. The nobles either used various types of alcohol to satisfy their thirst for water, or bought water from other places with naturally clean water. As for the common people and lower-class people, most of them drew water from rivers and canals. The Seine River can be said to be tolerant of everything. People draw water from it, swim, bathe, wash clothes, clean leather, kill fish, slaughter livestock, and dump feces, all in it. The entire river is dark, but even so, it is the water of life for the unindustrialized. Every time Louis saw it, he suspected that the city was indeed favored by God. In such a dirty situation, there was no frequent plague. The king intended to build a canal to divert water from the Thylon River, a tributary of the Oise River in the north of Paris, to Paris, but the project lacked both money and time. The estimated time of 5 years forced the king to find another way. He hoped that Liviu could build a small reservoir where the Seine River entered Paris. The water in the reservoir would be introduced into the palace after preliminary treatment and used as clean water and sewage. Louis could only temporarily divert it to the Seine River. Although he was also looking for a better solution, the French at that time still believed that feces were as dirty and sinful as the devil. It was not an easy task to get them to deal with it properly and throw it in the fields, considering that even toilets and feces dumped on the road would eventually be washed into the Seine River. The king could only comfort himself that this was just a stopgap measure. Anyway, he was tired of moving from one palace to another every once in a while to deal with filth. Liviu looked at the rough drawings provided by the king in detail. The toilet. He saw that the main material of the logo on it was ceramic, and he couldn't help but be slightly surprised. People in Europe have admired porcelain for a long time, dating back to the Roman period. While they spent a lot of money to buy ceramics from the East, they also tried to imitate them. At this time, there were also many imitation-colored pottery utensils in Louis's court, but compared with real porcelain, they were not smooth enough, not greasy enough, and they were easy to crack and leak water after being used for a period of time. Even so, pottery produced in Naville, Lyon and Rouen is still an important family property, regarded as a treasure by many middle and lower classes. In fact, the prototype of the toilet has been presented to the king, but after testing, it was found that it was easier to break than porcelain plates, jars, etc., especially at the bends of the pipes, which were easy to be made thin and finally broken by the rushing water. Later, a goldsmith managed to make a brass bend before it could be barely put into use. Before using it, a wooden seat frame had to be made for it, both for beauty and to ensure the safety of the user. But such things were probably not affordable for many people except important ministers and nobles. Louis only equipped such pottery in a few important suites, and others could only use the same room or toilet. Even so, the required drainage project was quite huge. Fortunately, Louis could move around. He renovated the flower gallery between the Tuileries Palace and the Louvre, and then officially named the Richelieu House as the Royal Palace, officially incorporating it into the Bourbon family's palace group. Of course, for the king, personal needs are always lower than the needs of the country. Although he has not yet officially taken office, Bishop Mazarin has allowed him to attend some important meetings. The king sits in the first seat, but mostly just listens in. After all, he is still a novice who is still in the learning stage. He can't even call out the names of most people. Some things that concern him are, Prince Condé has been fighting for Spain, but when facing Viscount Turenne, his victories are not as many as before. It may be that Viscount Turenne is well aware of his style of using troops, or he does not want to face his former colleagues and subordinates. Financial Director Nicolas Fouquet used the funds of the treasury to lend and obtained considerable profits. Duke Gaston fell seriously ill in Aix-en-Provence and was dying. To make sure is he really dying or does he have other plans? The envoy to the Kingdom of Naples has returned. The situation is not as good as the bishop expected. The people of Naples hate the Spaniards, but they are not interested in the French. Cromwell, the protector of England, unified Scotland and Ireland. He is now called His Royal Highness by his subordinates. Some people also suggest that he take the throne. His army occupied Jamaica not long ago. Although the king has said so before, some ministers still suggest that they maintain good relations with Cromwell. King Carl X of Sweden is still delaying and evading the request of Lady Christina Alexandra. In the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1632, the French colony of Quebec in America was returned to France by Britain. Now it needs a manager, and whether it should be divided into a city or a province. After attending the meeting, the king will go back to look through the books, records, and the information given to him by the bishop. He has not yet officially come to power, but he has already felt the pressure of 120,000 points. So tonight he rarely stayed in the study to kill some free time before going to bed, but went to the Queen Mother. The king was only outside the door when he heard loud and joyful shouts. Chapter 78 Mary Mancini's Pursuit. The attendants loudly announced the arrival of the king, and everyone in the room stood up and knelt to salute. Louis glanced around and found that almost all the people here were women. There were about 3 round tables in this spacious room, but everyone sat around the table where the Queen Mother was, just like the petals of a sunflower around a seed plate. Louis walked over and kissed the Queen Mother's hand. Duke Philip of Anjou immediately gave him the seat closest to the Queen Mother, and then everyone moved out of their original seats in order, starting with the prince's brother. The king took a look and saw that Lady Christina Alexandra was present. Unlike the first night, according to her current status, she was placed next to the Queen Mother Mary and Princess Henrietta of England. The Duchess of Montpensier had the honor of sitting on the left side of the Queen Mother. Marie Mancini stood behind the Queen Mother and stood in a row with other ladies. Seeing the king, she couldn't help missing him in her heart. They hadn't been able to play together for several weeks, so she winked at the king. The Queen Mother might have seen it, but said nothing and just turned her head away. The Duchess of Montpensier was a little unhappy. Although her previous reckless behavior made her completely lose the possibility of becoming the Queen of France, she was still very unhappy to see another woman of humble origin being so indulgent to the king. "Miss Mancini," she said, "bring me a glass of Takagi." According to etiquette and status, this kind of thing should not be done by the Queen Mother's maid. The Duchess of Montpensier was so bold, only because with her abundant financial resources, she was not only able to return to the court, but also once again won the favor of the Queen Mother and the king's attention. Mary Mancini's mind was all on the king, and she did it without thinking. If Mary refused or yelled angrily, the Queen Mother and the king were prepared to mediate. But Mary's reaction was beyond their expectations, which made them laugh and cry. The king stretched out his hand and took the Takagi wine that Mary brought. "Thank you, Mary," he said affectionately. If she poured wine for the king, it was very appropriate for Mary's status, and no one would underestimate her. The Queen Mother asked another maid to pour wine for her and others. They shouted in unison, toasting the king's health, and the matter was quietly covered up. Princess Henrietta was now 12 years old. According to the age of the princesses, this age was enough to be a wife or even a mother, but poor her could only be an exiled princess in Paris. Her brother Charles II was still struggling in the Low Countries, and the hope of restoration was getting slimmer day by day. The French ministers looked at them very unkindly, and some of them suggested handing them over to the traitor Cromwell. If it weren't for Louis' insistence, they might really be expelled from Paris, and then, she didn't know where to go. Compared with Charles II, their value was even lower, so low that it was difficult for anyone to protect them. For this reason, she was full of gratitude to Louis XIV. When she was still a child, her mother and brother tried every means to make her the wife of Louis XIV, but neither the Queen Mother nor Bishop Mazarin agreed. Henrietta admitted that at that time, she did try her best to get close to Louis according to her mother's instructions. After all, she came from a prominent family. If Louis fell in love with her, then the Queen Mother and the bishop might consider their marriage, but until now, she also knew that this hope was too slim, so her brother wrote to say that she could consider marrying Philip, Duke of Anjou, because as for the Duke of Gaston, his only son had died several years ago, and he had only an illegitimate son. He could not inherit the Duke's title and territory, so the Duke's territory and title would inevitably be transferred to Philip, Duke of Anjou. Together with the property the Duke got from his mother, the prince's brother Philip's wealth was already extremely huge. No one asked her if she was willing, and no one considered her. What she had fought so hard for before had almost become a joke. It was impossible to say that the Duke of Anjou knew nothing about it. Henrietta still remembered clearly how Philip pushed her to the ground fiercely, just because she sat in the seat closest to the king. She was not qualified. In the French court, the Duchess of Montpensier sat in front of her. Although Henrietta knew that even her brother had to bow in front of Louis, she still couldn't help but feel resentful, and at the same time she had a fear of unwillingness. She didn't even dare to be alone with Philip, the Duke of Anjou. Although the court ladies said that he was as gentle and lovely as a lady, Henrietta could see that although the bishop and the Queen Mother deliberately cultivated him in a feminine direction to avoid internal strife, under the protection of Louis, the heart of this prince was still as cold and hard as steel. All the softness and tenderness were only on the surface, not on the inside. Ironically, she might not even get the marriage contract now, because since the Duchess of Montpensier returned to the court, the Queen Mother and the bishop had intended to match him with the Duchess of Montpensier. It was obvious that in addition to the Duke of Gaston's territory and title, the two also wanted to get his daughter's assets for the Duke of Anjou, and the king also acquiesced. He respected the Duchess of Montpensier very much. For example, now, he did not want to humiliate Miss Marie Mancini, but he did not want to make the Duchess of Montpensier unhappy. So in the following card game, He amiably became an ally on the table with the Duchess of Montpensier. The two of them worked together to beat the bishop and the queen mother on the card table and emptied their purses. The Duchess won about 500 livres, which was nothing to her. After the last game, she grabbed the Louis d'Or and threw it to everyone. In the golden rain, her laughter was as loud as thunder. The Duchess of Montpensier had a very good night, and the king ordered Bonhomme to send a purse containing 100 Louis d'Or to Princess Henrietta, because he noticed that Princess Henrietta was very nervous at the card table today, and she seemed to faint every time she got a bad hand. Because Charles I was unable to be restored to the throne, Queen Mary had been forced to ask her enemy Cromwell to transfer part of her husband's inheritance and income to her, but both the letter and the messenger were in vain, and the princess must be in a very tight spot. While the king was concentrating on telling Bonhomme about this, a room on the corridor suddenly opened its door, and a soft arm pulled the king in, which frightened the king's attendant. He was about to shout, but Bonhomme stopped him. "That's Miss Mancini," he said, and the attendant smiled knowingly. "Marie." "It's me. Your Majesty." "It's me." The king knew very well how Marie felt about him. To be exact, he had used this feeling in a despicable way. From the beginning, Marie had only entered the court as the niece of Bishop Mazarin, not as a witch from the other world. But what the king needed was a witch, or someone who knew about the other world. Before Viceroy showed up, the only person he could catch was Marie. Later, Marie became the maid of the Queen Mother, and he also needed to use her to get the Queen Mother's attentions. He indulged Marie's love for him, even though he knew it would be fruitless. "I love you, Louis." Louis held her hand. Marie's hands were small, and her fingers were thin. Louis, who had to take martial arts classes every day and paid great attention to his own development, could easily hold them all in one hand. "What about you? Do you love me, Louis?" Louis. "Marie," Louis said in the dark, "you know that the bishop and the Queen Mother are preparing for my marriage." "Louis. You know, right?" Louis said, "You are the maid of the Queen Mother." "Louis, please. I can't love you, Marie." "But I love you, Louis. Can't you love me a little? Just a little? Do you know the consequences of this? You will lose your reputation and will not be able to get a satisfactory marriage, because others will only regard you as my lover." "I don't care, Louis, as long as you are willing to love me. Think about it, Marie, your father, your family, they only hope that you can become the legal wife of a nobleman, not the king's lover, the so-called royal lady. Let them all go to hell." "Louis." Louis held Marie down. She really had a pair of magic hands. "Don't do anything that will make me and you regret, Marie. Go back to your room. No one will know that we have been together." "Louis. Go. Don't be a disobedient child. I will convince you." "It's not me you need to convince," said the king. The king had to let Mary Mancini leave first. Everyone knew that Mary loved him. If they walked together at the same time, there would be rumors. Mary left, stomping angrily along the way. "I'll take a rest here," said the king, and then returned to the room and closed the door. This room had also been tortured. The bed curtains and curtains were pulled away, and the bright moonlight poured into the room from the window. There was no other furniture in the room except a bed frame. The king sat on the bed frame and watched the dark shadows on the glass window flow into the room, and then stood up on the dusty floor. Prince Theodoric of Anjou bowed to the king. "Did you find me, Your Majesty?" "Well, it's quite clear," the king said, "a group of small bats lying on the glass. I came here for the previous appointment," Prince Theodoric said. Chapter 79 Cats and Skunks, recommended by Sam Jiang. The king looked at the Prince of Anjou carefully. He saw him transfer the cane he never left from his right hand to his left hand, then reached into the pocket of his coat and fumbled around, took out a soft, round object, put it in front of Louis, and opened his fingers, so Louis saw a sleeping kitten. Prince Vanzo saw the king raise his head and look at him with an indescribable expression. "Well, please take it, Your Majesty." Prince Vanzo said, "This is me, a part of me. A part of you." The king repeated. He did know and saw with his own eyes that vampires turned into a group of bats and flew away, but he had never thought that a group of bats could actually separate a kitten. He couldn't help but look up and down at Prince Vanzo, wanting to see which party was missing. Theodoric felt uncomfortable under the subtle look, so he raised his hand and let Louis see his left hand, where a ring finger was missing, which must be the part that turned into the kitten. Although it should be a bat, it is obvious that a kitten is more suitable to appear in front of the public than a bat. The issue of kittens and bats dates back to the 11th century or earlier. Compared with the lofty status of cats in ancient Rome, after the whole of Europe was ruled by God, cats were regarded as animals that only witches would raise, along with lizards, bats and toads. Perhaps because they were too agile and difficult to understand, people associated them with evil omens. They said that cats would fly through the sky on broomsticks with witches to find poisonous herbs, and that witches would transform into cats to enter homes to attack babies, or that cats would jump over the dead and turn them into zombies. But compared to bats, which have never been accepted by people, cats have been a disaster. For cats, in the 13th century, the Pope ordered people to burn all cats, and after the Black Death returned in 1347, people gradually realized that cats could curb the spread of rats, and curbing the spread of rats meant that the plague could be eliminated, but at that time cats were still viewed with caution and fear by people. If you want to say when cats were truly accepted again, it was probably when people in Europe entered the age of exploration. In order to eliminate rats, there were one or more cats on every ship, and they gradually became a symbol of good luck, especially those cats that survived the shipwreck. Now you can see people raising cats in some villages and towns, and people no longer make a fuss when they see cats, except for pure black cats. Won't this hinder your actions? Louis asked. I thought you would give me a descendant. I have no descendants, said Theodoric. Where is your minister? Theodoric shook his head. Louis did not continue to ask. After all, even in the other world, vampires are the most secretive and self-centered race. Moreover, as a mortal, Louis was not sure whether Theodoric's thoughts could be understood by himself, so why bother? What can it do? You can think of it as a small me, Theodoric said. It can do most of the things I can do, except that it needs to use external objects or requires enough magic power. It can take the full force of Amen on your behalf. Louis pinched the kitten. Also, Theodoric said, it is precisely because it is also me, so if there is something you don't want others to know, it's best not to bring it with you. I will. Louis said. Theodoric's implication was that he could lend his power to ensure the king's safety, but he was unwilling to let the king take a peek at things that he should not know, or even step into danger that he should not be exposed to. Will it be detected? The king asked. He was now surrounded by priests of the Inquisition. Although the chief judge, Hilarius, did not seem to care what the king had with him, he at least wanted to make sure that if a part of Theodoric remained with him, there would be no troublesome problems. As long as it does not use its power and is not exposed to direct sunlight, it will become weak, Theodoric said. Then it is just an ordinary kitten. Does it need to eat? If you like, it needs a small amount of fresh blood. Louis nodded. Theodoric glanced at the king, sighed sadly, and lifted the cloak behind him. When the cloak fell, he disappeared with it. A wisp of gray smoke drilled out from the gap in the window. The wind blew it and it quickly disappeared from the king's sight. The king took the kitten and left the room. When he saw Bontang, he took the kitten by its paw and put it in Bontang's hand. Bontang didn't realize what it was at first. When he realized it was a kitten, he couldn't help but stroke it. Where did it come from? From the room just now, Louis said. I think I disturbed its sleep. Are you going to let it go? Put it in a birdcage, Louis said, and hang it in my room. The next day, everyone in the court knew that the king had a kitten. A furry little whirlwind blew among the nobles. The king was happy to see this. After all, cats were much cuter and safer than mice. The first person to visit the kitten was Mary Mancini, but it was hard to tell whether she came to see the kitten or the king. When the king saw her, he remembered that he didn't seem to have seen a cat around Mancini. They all stayed in Lazio. Marie sat lazily at the king's feet, her head resting on his knees. The kitten was sleeping on her skirt, her belly heaving. Bontang had given it a fresh quail in the morning, and it ate it greedily, and seemed quite satisfied, which made Louis feel relieved. In the bright light, the kitten's fur was blue-gray, with a pair of amber eyes, and its body and head were two round balls, which looked completely inconsistent with its original body. I also have several lizards, Marie said, but my father won't let me bring them here. The maids would scream when they see lizards, Louis said, and he felt warm where Marie leaned against him. The king reached out and touched Marie's curly hair. She purred softly like a kitten, and Louis' eyes softened. He knew he should refuse Marie, and it was easy for him, but he had to admit that he was also attracted to Marie. But I asked Felipe to bring it to me, I mean my cat, Mary said. It is said that many people in the court now have cats, so my uncle agreed to my request. What kind of cat is yours? "Angora cats come from Turkey," said Mary. "Yours is just a Charlotte blue cat." She lifted the kitten up and took a look, then gave the king an answer amid its uneasy cries. "It has a bell, a male." The king thought this was certain. He pinched the kitten's neck and took it out of Mary's hands, hoping that the connection between Prince Vanzo and it would not be too close. He put the kitten in a drawer, and in order to divert Mary's attention, he asked, "Who is Felipe?" "My brother," said Mary, "the most annoying one." "Then he is also a Mancini." Louis said. He seemed to have heard the bishop mention this name, and it was said that the bishop intended to seek a duke's title for him. "Why do you say it is the most annoying? Have you seen a skunk?" Mary said, "Multiply by 10. Felipe Jules Mancini was not as hateful as Mary said. The Mancini family was full of beauties. Mary was like this, and so was Mary's sister Anne, who was about to marry Prince Conti. Felipe was no exception. Compared to Mary, he was already an adult, with dark gray eyes and long brown hair. The ends of his eyes were exactly the same as Mary's, slightly tilted upwards, with a smile. His lips were rosy and full, better than any noble lady. If there was anything that was really disgusting, it was his eyes. Those eyes were always full of ripples. When they were on a woman, they were worthy of people's pity, but when they were on a man, they made people feel uncomfortable, at least for Louis. His dress was no simpler than that of the Duke of Anjou, the prince's brother Philip. The Italian's romanticism and domineering were clearly revealed in him. He exuded a rich and strong fragrance, like a rose in its prime. The crimson velvet and satin set off the pearls and diamonds, making him sparkle from fingers to toes. It is undeniable that Felipe was loved by most of the noble ladies. The Queen Mother even allowed him to pour wine for her at dinner. For a young man without a title, this was obviously a great honor. His temper was not as bad as Mary said. He treated praise and curse equally, not because he was broad-minded, but because he didn't care. He was indeed frivolous by nature and good at making trouble. Within a few months after arriving in Paris, he had several sweet nests inside and outside the court. Even Count d'Artagnan, who was favored by no less than 3 noble ladies, could not compare with him. But apart from these, this man can only be said to be useless. After meeting him a few times, the king completely put him aside. He could indeed give him a duke's title, but even if it was to praise Bishop Mazarin, he didn't want to do so. He didn't want those who recognized him to think that an incompetent and dissolute boy could be compared with him. Maybe, after the situation was completely settled, he would deal with it differently, but now, not. After Felipe's several unsuccessful requests for an audience with the king, he realized that he was not favored by the king. Later, Louis often saw him next to the Queen Mother. This was normal. Many people would go to the Queen Mother or the bishop for help after hitting a wall with the king, and Felipe was indeed gifted with women. Chapter 80 The King's Fury. The king once again thought of Mr. Mancini instead of Miss Mancini when Count d'Artagnan reminded him. The count angrily challenged Felipe Jules Mancini to a duel because he had taken away Madame Lafayette's heart. Madame Lafayette was a beautiful woman of about 20 years old. She was not outstanding in the court of Paris in terms of appearance. In terms of status, she was more known as the companion of the Duchess of Montpensier. She was superior to other noble ladies in her gentleness, chastity and profound literary accomplishment, especially the last one. When most women's education was still limited to religion and needlework, she was able to write moving poems and articles, which could only be said to be very rare and respectable. There were many people pursuing her, and Count d'Artagnan was one of them. It would not be surprising if this wise lady chose the king, a general or a scholar, but she finally succumbed to Mr. Felipe. No wonder d'Artagnan was so furious. When the king hurried to the room where they were, the scene was already tense. Madame Lafayette fainted and was helped to the next room to rest. Felipe was smiling, his hands in his coat, and his face was nonchalant. D'Artagnan looked serious, his shoulders tense, and he kept looking at the wall while groping for his sword. I think he was worried about Madame Lafayette, who was still in a coma. There were also several dukes and officials, almost all of them stood on d'Artagnan's side, staring at Felipe. "Who can tell me what's going on?" the king asked. D'Artagnan was pushed gently, but he was not very afraid. Of course, Philippe was the bishop's nephew, but he was also favored by the king. So he suppressed his anger and told the king what had just happened. In the court, contacts between men and women were rarely criticized. Although it was confusing that Madame Lafayette chose Philippe, d'Artagnan and other suitors had never done anything despicable to hinder or obstruct their love. But Philippe had openly pulled out a gorgeous ribbon from his sleeve at the party just now, Madame Lafayette's garter. Madame Lafayette immediately fainted, and Count d'Artagnan drew his sword in rage. Louis now knew why Marie called her brother a skunk. He pressed his forehead. In the court, duels were not allowed without the king's order, but he really wanted d'Artagnan to pierce this guy with a sword. "Please put away your swords, gentlemen," he said. "I don't allow you to bleed in my mother's suite. But only blood can pay for the humiliation of a respectable lady by the sinner," d'Artagnan said with gritted teeth. "I never agree to solve problems with duels." The king said. He saw Philippe smiled, and d'Artagnan was pale with anger. "But sometimes, duels can also be a way." He turned to the cardinal's nephew. "I want you to go to the street outside to solve this problem, but I don't allow you to take each other's life." "Then should I accept this rude request?" Philippe said. Louis glanced at him unexpectedly. After all, this matter was entirely caused by his frivolity, and Louis did not like a man who looked down on women. She was his lover, so much? But since Philippe was the nephew of Bishop Mazarin after all, Louis just wanted d'Artagnan to give him a small punishment, but Philippe's response showed that he did not understand the king's good intentions at all. From this room, you can see Philippe and d'Artagnan and others walking on the street. According to the convention of dueling, they should each have 2 assistants. D'Artagnan chose 2 musketeers, who were also his subordinates, as assistants, and one of Philippe's assistants was surprising, because he was Philippe, Duke of Anjou. Louis frowned. Although d'Artagnan was too lenient in love, he was no less brave in battle than any other warrior. He rushed at Philippe, but Philippe retreated without any shame, leaving the battle to the Duke of Anjou. D'Artagnan could not help but be restrained in front of his brother. He wanted to knock his brother's weapon away, but Philippe's grades in martial arts were not fake. He shuttled under d'Artagnan's sword like a glittering fish. When d'Artagnan intended to end the battle with a sprint, he slipped sideways under d'Artagnan's sword tip, and then with a strong blow, pierced d'Artagnan's arm. At this time, his red shoulder strap that was cut off slowly fell down. Just when the other 2 musketeers could not decide whether to step forward, Bonhomme ran over quickly and stopped the duel. With the help of the king's brother Philippe, this shameless villain was able to retreat unscathed. D'Artagnan insisted on continuing the duel, but was forcibly suppressed by the king. "I want to talk to you," Louis said to Philippe, and then he glanced at Philippe, who was standing not far away. The bishop's nephew's face was unpredictable. Louis thought Philippe would come to him soon, but he waited until it was almost time to go to bed, and he didn't wait for his brother. He sat there, always feeling palpitations and uneasiness, so he went to the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother was praying in the evening. When she saw the king and heard that the king was also looking for Philippe, she was very surprised, because Philippe had left early in the morning, and she thought he went to find his brother. When the king was anxious, he caught a glimpse of Mary holding a candle tray for the Queen Mother. Mary subconsciously turned her head to avoid Louis' sight, but such an action was purely a cover-up. The king only called Mary, and she surrendered. Marie led the king through corridors and stairs to a remote palace room. The king became more and more nervous, and at this moment they heard a low shout. Louis wanted to rush in immediately, but suddenly stopped. "Don't follow me," he shouted sternly. Although Bonhomme and the servants were reluctant, the king was now very powerful, so they stopped, and Marie followed closely behind the king. It was a small suite with only 3 rooms. It belonged to some officials who were trusted by the king but did not have rooms in the Louvre. They would stay there temporarily when they attended banquets or meetings too late. Therefore, the furniture in the room was simple but quite comfortable and complete. Louis quickly searched the outermost small hall and saw Philippe's sword thrown on the ground. Although there was no candle lit here, the moonlight was shining in from outside the door, and the scabbard of Philippe's sword was always inlaid with jewels. Louis found a shining pin in front of the door between the small hall and the bedroom. It was also Philippe's. The bedroom door was closed. Louis kicked the door without thinking. It shook violently but did not open. "I'll do it," Mary said, and then she threw a pile of ashes on the door handle. After reciting a short Latin word, the handle fell to the ground with a snap. The king kicked it again, and this time it opened with a bang. The whole door swung back and hit the wall. There was someone in the dormitory, gasping in pain, and there was a strange fragrance mixed with a strong smell of blood. Mary's face suddenly became very ugly. Fortunately, the king couldn't see it in the dark. Then she heard Louis say, "Light the candle." "No," a young man shouted, But Mary would not obey the second person's order. She put her hand on the candlestick, and the candle flashed and was lit. The first person Louis saw was Felipe, who was only wearing a linen underwear and bare legs. Then he saw his brother Philip, who was leaning against a bed. He was dressed neatly, but was holding his shoulder, where blood was constantly flowing. When he saw Louis, he shouted loudly, "Kill him! Louis! Brother, kill him!" Felipe looked panicked. "Wait! Your Majesty, I can explain." "Explain to the devil," Louis said. He didn't want to hear what the other party said at all. He didn't even want to know what happened before. He only knew that things had not reached the worst point and there was still a possibility of recovery. He raised his sword and forced Felipe, who was unarmed. Felipe wanted to struggle, but when he saw the king's eyes, he knew that the situation was over. He saw a flash of sword light, and his shoulder was pierced. The man who was originally still complacent and reckless screamed, "Mari! Save me!" and rolled and crawled to escape from the king's sword. Mari stood there, motionless. The king chased after him. Ever since he knew there was a dangerous other world, he had never slacked off in his martial arts lessons, even though mortal strength could not compete with these monsters. He stabbed Felipe in the thigh again. He groaned and tried to crawl towards Philip, but Louis kicked him over and pointed the tip of his sword at his chest. But Felipe did not seek help from his brother, but from his bag of spell materials. He chanted a spell loudly and raised his finger to Louis. Mary rushed over, but faster than her was a small gray shadow. The king's cat jumped out of his pocket and fell on Felipe's face while dispersing the spell, digging out his eyeballs. Louis stabbed down, and the tip of the sword slid on Felipe's ribs and pierced his lungs. He coughed violently. Don't kill me!" he shouted weakly. "It was Mr. Bishop, it was Mr. Bishop who asked me to do this." And the king silently raised his sword and pierced his throat with all his strength. Then there was a terrible silence. The king stepped over Felipe's body and came to his brother. He had fainted from loss of blood, and Louis was not sure if he had heard anything. "Nothing happened tonight," Louis said. Marie. Chapter 81 The King's Thoughts, Part 1, recommended by Sam Jiang. Mary was completely speechless. Things changed so fast that she could not understand how things had evolved to such a situation. No, she had noticed something. After all, she was also a wizard, and she knew what kind of person her brother Felipe was. A woman like Madame Lafayette, who was not only of noble status, but also well-educated and knowledgeable, and was also the companion of the Duchess of Montpensier, could not have any hope for a man like Felipe who had neither status nor bearing. No matter how handsome he was, he could not win the favor of this lady, let alone be manipulated by her like a puppet. When she was in the other world, Felipe's potions course was indeed better than hers. The king checked his brother's wound. The gilded dagger also belonged to Philip, Duke of Anjou. In other words, the most likely possibility was that he stabbed himself when he realized something was wrong. Louis didn't know what Philip had done to him and the other ladies, but he had remembered the bottles of potions that Vesalius had placed in front of him. If he had known before that potions could silently confuse a person's mind, he would never have taken it lightly. But now was obviously not the time to pursue the matter. Louis avoided Philip's wound and transferred him to his shoulders. Fortunately, Philip was very thin and the king was strong enough, so it was not difficult to carry him. Mary ran over and opened the door for him. When the king appeared in front of Bontang with his injured brother, he and his attendants were surprised. The king told them calmly that he and his brother had met an assassin. Unfortunately, in order to hide his tracks, the assassin killed Mr. Felipe, the nephew of the bishop, and the prince was injured while protecting him. As soon as they saw the king's gloomy eyes, Bontang and his attendants knew that no matter what the truth was tonight, this was the only thing they could tell. Two attendants went into the room to clean up the mess. The king took Philip back to his bedroom. He asked the royal doctor to treat his brother, and then sat alone in the small hall outside. 10 minutes later, there were chaotic footsteps in the corridor, and the panicked queen mother and the ladies hurried over. "How is he?" the queen mother shouted. "Philip, how is he?" "Louis." Louis stood up and held the queen mother's hand. "His shoulder is injured and the doctor is treating him. Let me go in and see him." "The scene inside is not suitable for you," the king whispered. "Mother." "He is my son," the queen mother insisted. But she soon discovered that the king was standing between her and the bedroom, motionless. She looked at Louis, as if she had realized something. The changes in that remote room could be hidden from others, but not from the Queen Mother. A surge of anger surged in her heart. She clenched her fists, and her lips trembled uncontrollably. "You are doubting me," she shouted. "You are doubting me. Do you think it's me?" "Shh." Louis shouted sternly, and his fierce look made the Queen Mother take a step back. Seeing her like this, Louis' attitude softened a little. "Go back to your room, Mother," he said. "If I need anything, or if Philip's condition changes, I will tell you. Go back and pray for him. This is what you should do most now." The Queen Mother's lips moved a few times. She wanted to say something, but fell silent. Louis watched the Queen Mother and others leave the room. He asked Bontom to wait outside and went into the bedroom. The doctors had cut off the Duke's coat and shirt and were using strong liquor to clean Philip's wound. Fortunately, the gilded dagger was more of an ornament and was occasionally used as a table knife, so there was not much dirt on it. The reason why the king came to see it in person was to ensure that the doctors would not propose some medical plans that were more like torture than treatment. By the way, before entering the room, these doctors were ordered to wash their hands and faces, wear satin masks, and cover themselves with loose and clean robes. One doctor proposed to use weapon ointment, which was approved by other doctors, and Louis also allowed it. Well, speaking of this weapon ointment, it may be the most effective trauma treatment medicine of this era, only referring to the surface world, because the way to use this ointment is, first find the knife or sword that caused the wound, and then apply this ointment on it. As for the patient, just wrap the wound with white cloth. The recovery rate of the wounded who use this ointment is the highest. Of course, for those who can see clearly, the benefit of this ointment is that it is not applied to the patient at all. At that time, doctors had no concept of cleanliness at all. Their hands were full of bacteria, and the drugs they used were often mixed with feces and dirt. People who were treated by them basically died. Only the luckiest people could escape death. The benefit of weapon ointment is probably that the patient does not have to touch it or the doctor. The biggest difficulty in using this ointment is that they must find the sword that caused the wound, but fortunately, the dagger that injured the prince was at the scene and was taken back by Bontam. While the doctors were noisily preparing the ointment, Louis sat down beside the bed and pressed Philip's forehead. Philip had already woken up. The wound was stimulated by strong liquor. Unless the person was dead, it would be difficult to continue to be unconscious. He looked at his brother and smiled with difficulty. Louis touched his wet hair soothingly. "Mary," he said, "have you got the medicine?" Mary nodded immediately, lifted her skirt, and took out 2 or 3 small bottles from the small bag tied to her petticoat. Louis felt that Philip was holding his hand tightly, and he immediately held it back. "Don't be afraid," he whispered in Philip's ear. "This is Mary. She is loyal to me. We are going to treat her wound now." In this era, trauma should not be underestimated. Many people died of fever caused by infection after being injured. Moreover, Philip used a lot of force when stabbing himself. The wound was deep enough to insert a little finger. The king did not want him to have any sequelae, so the wizard's medicine became the best choice. Mary handed over the bottle, and the king shook it in front of the candle, and found that there were at least 4 or 5 sips of potion in the brown glass bottle. "How much do you want to drink?" "3 sips will do," Mary said. The king looked at her deeply, and did not immediately hand the bottle to Philip, but took a sip himself. Mary screamed, and Louis frowned. "It's sweet," he said, then turned over his palm and saw that the wound on it was healing rapidly. It was caused by the excessive force when he killed Felipe. "Drink it," Louis said, but he didn't need to tell him to drink it. Philip immediately took the bottle and drank the potion in one breath. Obviously, compared with his fear of the wizard, he was more worried that his brother would take another sip. Even though he could feel that the pain disappeared by more than half after drinking the potion, he still felt disgusted with this devil's creation. Louis returned the bottle to Marie and watched Philippe fall back on the fluffy goose-down pillow. His face was still pale, but there was a hint of blood, at least much better than a few minutes ago, and the bloodstains on the clean linen did not expand any further. "I know you need to rest now," Louis said gently, "but I still have some questions for you." "Please go ahead, brother," Philippe said. "I want to know, what did Felipe do to you?" Louis asked. "I don't know much," Philippe said. "I only know that one day, I suddenly felt very fond of this man, your majesty, like a trustworthy friend. So when Count d'Artagnan asked for a duel, you became his assistant, right?" "Yes." "So what happened tonight?" Louis asked. "He proposed to me, Philip looked at Mary, who had been lowering her head. He didn't quite understand why his brother kept her here, but since the king did so, there must be a reason. He recalled what happened before. Under Louis' protection, the prince had never bowed his head to anyone, nor would he blame himself for the sins of others. Felipe died miserably in front of him. Even if he was severely punished, the punishment he received was no more than that. So Philip was not affected badly by this, so he said very happily, "I rejected him." He was very angry, and then said some stupid things. I don't know what it was, but when I found that my body was out of control, I gave myself a shot. Louis listened carefully and nodded. "Mary," he shouted, "do you know what this is?" Mary hesitated. It's not a very strong potion," she said. "If I must say, Your Majesty, it is used in some occasions where it is needed, for example, say." Louis didn't understand what she meant at all, but Philip did. The musketeers or ministers around the king certainly wouldn't talk to him about romantic affairs, but around the Queen Mother, the lady's topics could hardly avoid ambiguity. "I see," the prince interrupted her. He deeply hated Marie's brother, but he wasn't angry enough to lose his mind and humiliate an unmarried young woman. "Is it the same for Madame Lafayette?" "Yes," Marie said immediately. Almost at the same time, she felt a chill, almost instinctively, and she explained eagerly, "But that's all. It can only slightly affect the mood of the person being administered, making him feel happy and comfortable, just like hearing a bird singing, or seeing a gorgeous and fragrant rose. The more determined a person is, or the more defensive he is, the harder it is for this drug to work. So after he did that, Madame Lafayette refused to see him, and I could realize that something was wrong." Philip said, "I have no interest in sleeping with a man. He made a mistake." The king took out a silk handkerchief and wiped the cold sweat from his brother's forehead. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 82, The King's Thoughts, Part 2. Felipe had a good hand. Although Louis knew that he was a wizard, he was not so sensitive to these extraordinary people because of Marie and Vesalius. Felipe was a fool who could only talk big, so he would not attract the king's attention. The potion he used on the ladies and his brother Philip was not very effective. Those ladies, except Madame Lafayette, would not mind having a short relationship with a good-looking young man. But because he had a smooth journey, or because he was annoyed by the contempt of the king and the D'Artagnan and others, he actually did the shameful thing of showing Madame Lafayette's garter in front of everyone. Madame Lafayette might still be addicted to the wrong love, but no one could stand such stimulation, so after Felipe came back from the duel, she didn't want to see him again. Similarly, because of the suspenders incident, because women at that time only had a long linen underwear inside, and then put on layers of shirts, petticoats, coats, and skirts, so there was no small piece of fabric covering important parts as you and I know now. Their most secretive thing was the ribbon that fixed the stockings. The stockings at that time had no elasticity, on the thighs, which was called garters. Yes, lovers often used this little thing as a token of love, but such tokens would only be properly placed in men's shirts, not even in pockets and purses to avoid loss or damage. Philippe's behavior was completely humiliating Madame Lafayette and her admirers, and he deserved to be challenged to a duel, but it was also for this reason that Philip, Duke of Anjou, fought on his behalf and attracted the attention of the king. Others might only be surprised at the king's favor to the young gentleman, but how could Louis not know? For Philip, the only person who could make him willingly serve was his brother, not even the bishop or the queen mother. His behavior was already quite abnormal. As long as the king investigated, Philip's arrogant behavior would soon be discovered. No wonder he was so eager to gamble everything. Louis didn't know, and didn't want to know if he had any other tricks, but as he thought, all conspiracies would stop in the face of death. Philip died, and everything was over, no matter whether his last words were true or false. So will this drug have any other effects? Louis asked. Just stop taking it. Marie said, no, except that you will be a little weak, but only a little. Louis nodded. Philip was injured and Madame Lafayette was stimulated. It would not arouse anyone's suspicion if the two stayed in bed for a few more days. And those noble ladies, they were not healthy enough to begin with. The king kept in mind that there should be no balls or celebrations recently. I'm going to my mother, he said to Philip, I'm going to tell her that you are safe." Perhaps it was an illusion. Philip's eyes changed slightly, but he immediately smiled. "Of course," he said, "you have to tell the Queen Mother that I'm fine now." Louis held his hand, bent down to kiss Philip's forehead, made a gesture to Marie, and took him out of the room, and at the same time told Bonhomme not to let others disturb his brother's recuperation, especially the doctors. In the corridor, he met the doctors holding a tightly wrapped dagger that smelled of medicine. The king appreciated the culprit and then praised them greatly, so that they could go back to rest happily. On the way from the king's bedroom to the Queen Mother's residence, Louis did not say a word, and Marie also lost her spirit for a rare time. As soon as they entered the Queen Mother's suite, they saw that the Queen Mother's maids and a group of priests were all left in the corridor. Marie did not need the king's instructions and quickly returned to the team. Her dejected look made the usually strict female officials suppress their intention to reprimand her. Pa. This was the first sound the king heard when he stepped into the Queen Mother's room. The Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess, was not an arrogant and fierce person when she was a girl. When she arrived in France, her husband did not love her, and her mother-in-law, Marie de Medici, and her ally, Cardinal Richelieu, were dissatisfied with her because of her identity as a Spanish princess and a member of the Habsburgs. She spent a long period of depression and pain. More than 20 years of being alone in an empty room and people's slander made her gradually numb and indifferent. It was not until Louis and his brother Philip were born that she finally had hope. She also did not like Cardinal Mazarin, the heir of Richelieu, but Louis was only 5 years old at that time, and she needed a reliable partner, so she could only endure it. Although many of Mazarin's actions disgusted her deeply, there were always things that she absolutely could not accept. When the bishop shamelessly said that this was for the king, the Queen Mother could no longer bear it. She did something she had wanted to do for a long time but had never been able to do, that is, she swung her arm and gave the bastard a loud slap. The king saw this scene, and he had to admit that his tense heartstrings were slightly relaxed. His arrival made Bishop Mazarin feel relieved. He didn't want to face an extremely angry Queen Mother, or Mother. "Your Majesty, I killed Felipe," Louis said, and at the same time met the bishop's eyes. The king gave the bishop the impression of a smart and gentle child. Now he realized that intelligence was inevitable, and gentleness might be a disguise, or perhaps it couldn't be said to be a disguise, but it could only be said that when his bottom line was not touched, the king was indeed very tolerant. The bishop's anger due to the murder of his nephew was suddenly like being poured with a handful of ice water, and it was completely extinguished. "Your Majesty," he said. "Mr. Bishop," Louis said, without looking away, even though he did see reproach and pleading in the bishop's eyes, "I know you have always had some concerns." He laughed. "I also have to say that I have the same concerns, so," Louis took a breath, "I also indulged you and watched you do those things. Yes, anyone can blame you. Only I can't, because I am the beneficiary. I am an accomplice. If God wants to send down thunder, it will hit my head." "Louis!" the Queen Mother shouted. She clasped her hands in front of her chest, as if begging him not to say any more. "Please don't say that," Bishop Mazarin also said. "Your Majesty, this does no harm to the Duke of Anjou. I just want to ensure that there is someone around His Highness who can influence him. Your Majesty, this is just a game." "Maybe," Louis said. "I believe you, Mr. Bishop. You have also watched Philip grow up, and I believe you have feelings for him. But I must tell you that no matter what worries you and my mother have, my idea is that no matter when and for what, playing with a person's soul is a despicable and vicious thing. Philip is free. I give him this freedom. He can fall in love with anyone. He can fall in love with someone older than him. He can also fall in love with someone younger than him. He can fall in love with a woman. He can also fall in love with a man. He can fall in love with a rich person. He can fall in love with a poor person. He can fall in love with a noble person, or he can fall in love with a lowly person. He can even fall in love with a wizard, a devil, but the premise is that this love must come from his heart, not manipulated, seduced, or forced. This is my promise to him. You should be thankful that nothing happened tonight, otherwise not only Philip, but also I, would have to hate you." The Queen Mother almost fainted after hearing this, and the bishop's face turned pale, but Louis' heart was as hard as steel at this time. He looked at them again to let them see his determination, then bowed lightly and retreated as usual. Chapter 83, The Bishop is Worried, recommended by Sam Jiang. If the bishop was angry before, he was depressed now. This was not the result he wanted. Although the Bible severely condemned all the bed curtain activities that were not for reproduction, everyone knew that the Roman priests had never been picky about meat and vegetables, and the people of Italy were even more passionate. This was true for both men and women. The Renaissance completely liberated their thoughts and desires. They were like the expelled Olympian gods, chasing beauty all day long and unable to extricate themselves. They were like the scholars of ancient Greece, indulging in an unspeakable, deformed love. This is true for Italians, Germans, Spanish, and even the British. Only the middle class is most likely to be criticized because they can neither be as unrestrained as the lower class nor as free as the upper class. When his nephew Philip was coldly treated by the king and rejected by the Queen Mother, he could not approach the Queen Mother. The bishop did not agree with the suggestion at first, but he also had to consider that the prestige of the king's younger brother, Philip, was approaching the king. The king had a gentle temperament and was not as glorious as his younger brother, so people often focused on the younger brother. The bishop also reminded the king, but Louis trusted his brother very much. Not only did he not alienate and treat the Duke of Anjou coldly as the bishop said, but he kept handing more and more important things to the younger brother. The visit of the former Queen of Sweden became the last weight on the bishop's heart. As for the king, he just dealt with the matter at hand and gave power and positions according to personal ability. He didn't even think that he took care of Philip very much. In this matter, just like he gave the position of Director of Finance to Fouquet, the position of Royal Engineer to Vauban, and the positions of General and Marshal to Viscount Turenne and Schomberg, it was purely out of public interest. But the bishop didn't think so. He was very willing to see a tolerant king, because he knew that those who wanted to seize the king's power would probably not have a good ending. Even he and the Queen Mother, out of such selfishness, did not want Louis to change. But the problem was that such tolerance would not be good for the king's younger brother. He had been keeping an eye on the Duke of Gaston and Blois. It was said that he was either drinking, sleeping, or cursing his brother and nephew loudly all day long. And he had not given up his ambition. The bishop was ready. If he was going to see God, he would take this hateful guy with him, although they might go different ways next. This idea did not come suddenly. Bishop Mazarin was born in a humble family, and in this era it was almost impossible for people of humble family to have a healthy body. Behind his graceful appearance was work and thinking day and night. The long-term lack of distinction between day and night made him age faster than his peers. He had been coughing recently, and the doctor asked him to find the fresh flesh of a red-haired man around 24 years old who was hanged, crucified or beheaded as a special medicine. He refused. The potion in the other world was much more effective, and the bishop would rather eat bat wings, toad legs or mouse tails than eat his own kind. He knew that Felipe had indeed been using special perfumes, wizard's perfumes, to win the favor of women. To be honest, it was no different from vain boys wearing a diamond ring on their fingers. He had also sternly warned him that his identity and abilities in the other world could not appear in the court. This was a taboo. All those in power could not tolerate themselves or their close ones being controlled, just like Merlin. He had done a lot for King Arthur. It can be said that Merlin contributed greatly to King Arthur being King Arthur, but he did two things wrong. One was to admit that he could control his destiny, and the second was to cast a spell to change the appearance of King Arthur's father, King Uther, so that Arthur was born. If the first thing could only be said to be unfounded, then the second thing undoubtedly hit the king's weakness. Who knew if Merlin would become his wife, lover or knight, and if that person would suddenly betray him and give him a fatal blow when he was off guard? King Arthur's disgust for Merlin is completely understandable, although he has never expressed it. However, how could Vivian, the Princess of Northumberland, make Merlin infatuated with her, make him obey her orders, and finally imprison him in the rock? No one can tell. And King Arthur's acquiescence in the church's large-scale crackdown on wizards is another mystery. As for whether the court began to expel wizards before or after this, it is even more unsolved. Now the kings of the surface world are willing to raise and drive wizards because the inner world is becoming increasingly weak. The families that originally migrated to the inner world are beginning to plan to return to the surface world. The Mancini family is not the only family that extends its tentacles to the outside world. While the Roman Church is constantly promoting its supreme and noble position, it is also gradually loosening the shackles on the Inquisition. At least a few hundred years ago, it was absolutely impossible for the Inquisition to continue to serve Protestantism. So why did the Church suddenly become kind? It was because they realized that the monks and their descendants in the inner world could not continue to fight against the wizards and dark creatures without the support of the outer world. Since they could control them, they were willing to loosen the chains in some places. So, if Felipe confessed to the bishop that he wanted to use some mean means on the Duke of Anjou, especially those related to witchcraft, the bishop would never allow it. But when the bishop asked, he just smiled and said that the Duke of Anjou, His Royal Highness, had a 120,000-point good impression of him, and the relationship between them might be deeper than that of friends. At that time, he asked His Royal Highness to say a few good words for him in front of the king, and the title of a duke would be at his fingertips. The bishop had no doubt about this. Mary only exposed her identity when the werewolves attacked the convoy, so her father and uncle came to blame her in person. Felipe was several years older than Mary, and he should understand the family's trend better and should not do such a stupid thing. But he did it. The bishop couldn't help but get a splitting headache at the thought of this, and he lost his temper when he saw Mancini's parents and his brothers. The strange thing was that they were both angry at each other's irresponsibility. Mancini's parents didn't dare to question the king, and were even more humiliated after being retorted by the bishop. When they ran to the Louvre to question Mary in a rage, they couldn't get clothes at all. The last time they came to question Mary, the king was still in exile, the Grand Inquisitor Erasius of the Inquisition was still on the market, and the hunting palace in Versailles was simply a funnel. Not to mention a wizard, even a commoner could walk in with a swagger. Now the king is always accompanied by monks from the Inquisition. After the Felipe incident, the king asked Mary Mancini to move to a room next to his own. This move caused a lot of rumors, but the king can't care about it now. According to Mary, Felipe is her father's favorite child. It's hard to say what her father will do. Maybe he doesn't dare to do anything to the king, but in addition to Mary, he has many daughters. Mr. Bishop didn't know what to say when he heard these rumors. The reason why he indulged Felipe was because Louis never showed the love that a young boy should have for women. He was worried. Yes, it was the same for the other gender. He was surrounded by more of his servants, his marshals and his ministers, which was really worrying. In contrast, the king's younger brother Philip had reached the age to get married. Mr. Bishop didn't want to see the king's younger brother have children before the king, even if they were illegitimate children, so he just wanted to delay the king's younger brother's real adult age a little bit. Although it is possible that the prince's brother may have developed some bad preferences, it doesn't matter. There are also such cases among the nobles. They will still have a satisfactory marriage, a wife, and an heir. Although this cannot be made public, it will not become a disturbing handle. But can he say this to the king and the queen mother? No. In the end, the king invited the bishop to his study. They only talked for 10 minutes when they were alone and decided to compensate the Mancini family. Mary's sister, Mancini's eldest daughter, Laura Mancini, is discussing marriage with the Duke of Modena. The king will send an envoy to congratulate and send a gift worth 100,000 livres. The marriage between Prince Conti and this woman has also been basically agreed. The king will also send a gift worth 100,000 livres and lend them the palace of Fontainebleau so that they can have a decent place to conclude the marriage contract and complete the ceremony. And Marie Mancini, said the bishop, they also hope that she can have a prominent marriage. This time the king did not answer him. Chapter 84, Lady Christina is worried. As mentioned before, personal feelings must always give way to national affairs. Although Philip, Duke of Anjou, was still depressed and Marie Mancini was worried, the king could only promise the former to go hunting with him in Versailles, and then give the latter permission to enter and leave the king's study at any time, and then continue to be busy for France. The most important thing among them was probably the plan mentioned by Bishop Mazarin, which was to have Lady Christina Alexandra be nominated as the Queen of Naples. First of all, we should mention the history of Naples. Naples is a combination of a region located in southern Italy and Sicily. It was jointly occupied by the Byzantines, Lombards and Turks. Later, the Normans drove them all out and divided it into a country, which is Naples, but it has never been recognized by the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Decades later, this region was seized by the Holy Roman Emperor of the Hohenstaufen family. But in 1266, Charles of Anjou, the younger brother of King Louis XIV of France, obtained this country at the request of the Pope. Of course, Clement IV at that time was a French pope, and everyone knew where this request came from. At that time, the last member of the Hohenstaufen family, the well-off Latin, resolutely raised an army to fight against Charles, but was defeated and captured. Then, with the acquiescence of the Pope and the uproar of the people, Charles did not hesitate to chop off the head of the well-off Latin, making the family extinct and eliminating the last bit of trouble they might bring. After that, Charles moved the capital from Sicily to Naples, revealing his great ambition, but like every ruler, he was not friendly to the people of Naples. He levied heavy taxes and acted recklessly, which triggered the famous Sicilian Vespers riot. Sicily was thus split from Naples and became the property of the Spanish Aragon royal family. In the early 14th century, Naples had briefly prospered for a period of time, but from the late 14th century to the early 15th century, the Anjou royal family was in constant civil war. As a result, Alfonso V of Spain became the fisherman in the dispute between the snipe and the clam. In 1443, he used the title of the two Sicilies, referring to both Naples and Sicily. In 1495, it was recaptured by King Charles VI of France, but in less than 10 years, Spain regained control of the two places. After that, Spain also exploited them without a trace of mercy, triggering the Mancini incident. Just recently, in July 47. If France had not been in chaos at that time, Bishop Mazarin would have really wanted to intervene. It is the same now. The people of Naples are full of anger and resentment towards the Spaniards. With a little provocation, it is not difficult to repeat the Sicilian Vespers and the Mancini incident. Then they can push the former Queen of Sweden. Among the nobles, Christina's reputation is not bad, because she has always been keen on ennobling nobles to consolidate her rule, but merchants and officials do not like her, and perhaps civilians, perhaps because she was too extravagant when she was queen. She really loves to spend, but every monarch at that time was like this. It is easy for her to become the controller of Naples. The support of France, the recognition of the Roman Church, the promise to the people of Naples that she will never levy taxes arbitrarily, and perhaps get married and have children, these things are not difficult. The problem lies in the attitude of the King of France and the bishop. She has her own room in the Louvre, but she stays more with the Queen Mother to win the Queen Mother's favor. She also intends to please the king. She did not give the king expensive gifts, but gave him one person, René Descartes. René Descartes was a philosopher, physicist, mathematician, and theologian, and was deeply favored by the former Queen Christina of Sweden. However, the Roman Church hated him because, although he always insisted that he was a devout Catholic, he was always preaching secret deism and atheism. The French mathematician and one of the king's teachers, Blaise Pascal, once accused this old man, saying that there was no God in his philosophy and he did not need God, but God. He should not have said such a thing, because his mention of it aroused Louis' interest. He asked Bishop Mazarin to find him Descartes books, among which geometry, optics and meteorology were placed on the king's bookshelf. When Lady Christina saw them, she told the king that she would like to have Mr. Descartes come to France because he was a rare scholar who was humorous, knowledgeable and interesting. The king listened and asked her to write a letter to Mr. Descartes and sent two trustworthy people as messengers to greet the old man. Descartes was born in 1596. After winning the favor of the Queen of Sweden, he decided to move to Sweden, even though Her Majesty the Queen reminded him that the weather in Sweden was cold and not suitable for an old man. But a few years ago, he fell seriously ill. On the doctor's advice, he returned to the Netherlands, but he was not so happy because of the church's hostility towards him. With the invitation of the King of France, he naturally accepted the invitation and came to Paris. Count d'Artagnan found him a residence outside the Louvre, and the king gave him a sum of money to settle down. He had no wife and children, so he suddenly became extremely wealthy, not to mention the favor of the king. He immediately became a guest of honor at various gatherings, with servants serving him fine food and warm clothes. Mr. Descartes' health soon improved. Although he was still not as good as a young man, he was able to ride a horse and play tennis. But most of the time, he would rather lie on that comfortable big bed and let his thoughts run wild. The king liked the gift very much, and he had several long talks with her. However, it was also because of this that Louis felt that Lady Christina was not capable enough to be a king. Her emotions were too rich, her thoughts were too complicated, and she was easily driven by her personal feelings. Her character was too paranoid. These were just some minor flaws for a noble lady, but for a ruler, these weaknesses would be infinitely magnified by her enemies. He told Bishop Mazarin, and then the bishop said as a matter of course, "It is precisely because she is such a person that we need her to be the Queen of Naples." This sentence made Louis laugh. Yes, Their original intention was not to find a real, authoritative and capable monarch for Naples, but to build a solid barrier between France and Spain. But the thing they least wanted to happen still happened. Just as Christina was about to leave for Pesaro, where she was waiting for the final result of the negotiations between Naples and the French, a team of envoys from Spain suddenly appeared in Paris. Their arrival immediately caused Bishop Mazarin to terminate the plan, and there was a possibility of abortion. Christina was of course very angry about this. Who leaked this secret? She came to Paris, nominally to ask the King of France to mediate with her cousin, the current King of Sweden, on her pension. There were very few people who knew about this matter, almost countless. "I want to find that person." She said so to the king, and then went to Avignon in the name of pilgrimage. Chapter 85 Mr. Descartes is worried, Part 1. Louis thought that Lady Christine Alexandra, after all, had been the ruler of a country and should at least have some rationality, but he still underestimated her stubbornness and violence. Just when he and the bishop were busy dealing with the Spaniards, Lady Christine, who returned to Fontainebleau from Avignon, did something shocking. She executed her knight commander and her lover Manualdus. Although the king and the bishop knew that the knight commander was probably a traitor who betrayed the former Swedish queen, this lady had obviously done something wrong. First of all, because she was no longer the King of Sweden, she was now just a noble lady with territory, not to mention that she was now in France. Even if Manualdus had done something extremely treasonous, she should have put it under the rope of law instead of dealing with it herself. Secondly, even if she had done it, she should not have admitted that she was the one who led the matter. She could have easily pushed the blame on the hired officials, but she refused and admitted that she was the one who planned the incident. Finally, Lady Christina was still an unmarried woman to this day. Although Europe at that time was very tolerant of married men and women, it was very strict with young girls who had not yet entered into marriage, especially they were those noble ladies of status. Just like Louis repeatedly rejected Mary because she needed a spotless reputation to have a good marriage. Of course, almost no one could publicly accuse Lady Christina, but her execution of Manualdus was not as upright as a king executing a rebel. Instead, it brought an indelible pink shadow. When people mentioned her, they would say the woman who killed her lover, which made the good reputation that Bishop Mazarin promoted for her in Naples suddenly fall through. I am afraid that no one would believe that a young woman who not only lost her virginity before marriage but also killed her partner could treat subjects who had nothing to do with her with kindness. In fact, her cruelty and shame had completely pushed her away from the throne, both in Sweden and Naples. Bishop Mazarin was also very angry. He even discussed with the king whether he should be punished. Some ministers had suggested doing so. After all, in any country ruled by law, such a reckless act should not occur. If it were in England, even if the lady would not be beheaded, she would be ordered to enter a monastery and spend the rest of her life repenting for her reckless behavior. Before Louis made a decision, someone came to him to plead for Lady Christina. This person did not surprise the king because he was René Descartes. Since coming to France, René Descartes has been in much better spirit and health. He hardly looks like the man who almost died of poverty a few years ago. When Descartes met Christine, he was destitute, but he was not always like this. Descartes was born into a lower noble family in France. His father was a judge, so he also hoped that his son could become a judge. So he studied law and medicine in college, but he also had an amazing talent in mathematics. This is where the problem lies. On the one hand, Descartes was indeed a devout Catholic, because his university was affiliated with a Jesuit order, but on the other hand, his obsession with and mastery of mathematics gave him an incredible idea. That is, he wanted to use mathematics to prove the existence of God. He really did so, and then he initially concluded that the devil does not exist. The specific steps are roughly as follows. Humans are imperfect but God must be perfect. God created the world to the world. The devil is evil, so the perfect God would never create the devil. As you can imagine, this theory immediately angered the priests and bishops. He was questioned, criticized, and almost excommunicated. He was able to remain safe and sound thanks to the growing weakness of the Church and the contempt of the Inquisition, but also because he was hated by the priests. Although he was talented, he had never been favored by the nobles. So before his principles of philosophy was seen by the Queen, this scholar was almost in poverty. No wonder he packed his bags and ran to Stockholm when he heard that the Queen of Sweden was quite interested in him. Unfortunately, his mind could adapt to Stockholm, but his body could not, especially because the Queen was busy with state affairs. His classes were scheduled at 5 o'clock every morning. As you can imagine, such an old man had to get up from bed at 3 or 4 o'clock every day, tidy up his clothes, put away his lessons, and had to have a quick breakfast or even skip it. He rushed to the Three Crowns Palace to wait for Her Majesty the Queen. The Queen's schedule was always irregular, sometimes for official business, sometimes for private matters. In this way, Descartes fell ill within a few months and had to return to the Netherlands to recuperate. However, he was still somewhat grateful to Her Majesty the Queen. After all, Christina was the first noble who was willing to look at him squarely, and he also received considerable remuneration from her. But he did not expect that when he had just recovered and was about to return to Sweden, the Queen abdicated. This was a bolt from the blue for Descartes. Moreover, Christina later left Sweden and went to Rome and France. He was disappointed and thought that he would continue to be silent. Many of his books were banned by the church at that time. Who knew that Christina introduced him to the King of France? To be honest, Descartes preferred France. France was his hometown, and Louis was his king. Moreover, Louis was young, knowledgeable, intelligent, and undoubtedly orthodox. He also respected Descartes very much. Descartes received an annual pension of 3,000 livres from him, as well as a house not far from the Louvre. For the elderly scholar, these were already quite satisfying. After all, what he liked most was just to lie on a comfortable big bed and read and think. When he heard about Lady Christina, he also thought about it for a while, because he didn't know whether pleading for his wife without authorization would cause the king's dislike, or whether he would lose the king's favor. He was old and really couldn't stand another displacement, but in the end he decided to try it once, only once. He said to himself that he was not Bishop Mazarin and did not have that much affection for the king. When Bonhomme conveyed Descartes' request for an audience, Louis was not as unhappy as people thought. Madame Christine's reckless behavior did cause them a lot of trouble, but Louis was a gentle man and would not be happy to see people around him being so heartless. René Descartes had been favored by Christine when he was poor, and it was Christine who introduced him to Louis. If he pretended to know nothing like others at this time and ignored Madame Christine, the king would really be disgusted with this person. René Descartes was dressed very solemnly today. When he took off his hat to the king, he bowed very deeply and swiftly. Even his sparse white hair was dancing fiercely in the air. Bonhomme couldn't help but step forward to help him, so as to prevent this scholar who was not very good at flattery from falling directly to the ground. He thanked Bonhomme, and then bowed slightly to the king. Seeing him like this, Louis remembered a scandal circulating in the court when he first arrived at the Louvre. It was about Mr. Descartes and the former Queen of Sweden. It was said that Mr. Descartes was also a lover of the Queen. Of course, this was purely a rumor, perhaps just to discredit Mrs. Christina, because Mr. Descartes and Christina were 32 years apart in age. When they first met, Queen Christina was 26 years old and Mr. Descartes was 58 years old. Christina was still an unmarried young woman, while Mr. Descartes was already very old. He was still a very smart and good gentleman. In any case, it was impossible for him to occupy an important position in the Queen's heart. The Queen did appreciate his talent, but it was just talent. She was more interested in Descartes' philosophy than mathematics, so the Roman Church should not have been so unkind to Descartes. After all, no one knows whether Christina's shift from Protestantism to Catholicism was influenced by Descartes. There's only one chapter today, and I will continue to add more tomorrow. Chapter 86 Mr. Descartes is Worried, Part 2, recommended by Sam Jiang. As for why the king thought so, it was because from the mouth of Mr. René Descartes, he could fully restore the whole picture of this terrible incident, perhaps more than Father Lebel, who was waiting to hear the last prayers of the traitor. Mr. René Descartes' account was recorded in full by a servant who was waiting outside the door with keen hearing. After he no longer held his honorable position and returned to his hometown of Lille, he mentioned this incident in his memoirs. Because of the extraordinary details of the description, it was once considered to be a deliberate fabrication. Until the confession of Mrs. Christine Alexandra reappeared in the world, people compared them and found that there was almost no difference between the two. If there was any difference, it was probably Mr. Descartes' account, because he did pity this prominent and sad student and was biased in some words. Needless to say, Marcus Gian Rinaldo Manuel was an undoubted handsome man, and he was kind-hearted, good at poetry and duels, and admired by many noble ladies. Some people said that his only shortcoming was that he was the lover of Lady Christina, which was too bad, because the former queen was charged with many crimes, such as greed, vanity, and love of squandering. It was a fact that the former Queen of Sweden had conferred titles on 17 earls, 46 barons, and more than 400 lower-level nobles in the 10 years since she ascended the throne, and sold or mortgaged property worth 1.2 million Swedish silver coins to pay their salaries. After abdicating, she still indulged in pleasure, spending almost all of her income on music and art. She came to Paris, nominally asking the King of France to act as an intermediary to recover her territory income from the King of Sweden, and it was not entirely for cover-up. Of course, there are more charges against this woman. She likes to wear men's clothes and doesn't like to dress up as a woman. She also has a close female friend. Some people say that she is a deformed person with both male and female characteristics. But ironically, some people say that she has an ambiguous relationship with a musician and a cardinal. Maybe it's true, because Louis has also heard of the name of the Prince of the Vatican. Anyway, in people's minds, she is not only not worthy of respect, but also not worthy of trust. Such cognition undoubtedly directly affects the former queen and the people around her. Louis feels the same way, because when he was in exile, he also did not dare to give full trust to the people around him, because he could not give them what they wanted, and they might turn to those who could give them benefits and honors at any time. So the king has set his sights on those little people who are not favored by the bishops or dukes from the beginning, just like he still trusts Colbert more than Fouquet. Marquis Monardies was naturally the latter. He might have really loved the queen once, but since she lost the throne, the situation took a sharp turn for the worse. She even had to ask the king and the Privy Council for money for her daily expenses, not to mention the people around her. They could hardly see the future, so it was no wonder that they would want to choose another shortcut. Louis guessed how the King of Sweden, Lady Christina's cousin, persuaded the commander. Sweden could get 1 million livres of income from France every year because France wanted to use it to balance the Holy Roman Empire. Similarly, Lady Christina would most likely be used as a bargaining chip in transactions between countries, and their end might not be good. In addition, if the young knight returned to Sweden, he could also join the king's army to gain merit. Wouldn't it be more glorious than being a noble lady's servant? However, Louis felt that the Swedish king probably did not care too much about the Marquis. Otherwise, he should at least pretend and not be so anxious. He should try to find another reason instead of just sending a team of courtiers to Paris to strangle the bishop's plan in the cradle. Christina Alexandra had guessed that there was a traitor around her, but not many people knew about it. She went to Avignon first because she wanted to plan a scam. She deliberately wrote a letter to Bishop Mazarin, which was said to be very important. The letter mentioned a reliable person, a Swedish official, who had some evidence that could make the ministers of the Privy Council lean towards the former queen instead of the current king. She wrote a total of 6 copies of this letter, each with a different name, and then gave them to the people she suspected. A few days later, she heard that the official was indeed arrested, and she knew that her lover had betrayed her, but she still did not act rashly at this time. With the help of the priest, she left Avignon openly, but returned to the city soon after. Under her command, some people caught people who had contact with Monaldisi, and there was evidence and testimony. Then she returned to Fontainebleau. Here we have to mention 2 key figures, or a pair of key figures, namely the brothers Francesco Santinelli. They were a pair of brothers that the former queen met in Pesaro when she was visiting the Pope. They loved Lady Christina, so they were willing to follow her and serve her. That night, Lady Christina summoned the Marquis Monardisi at the Palace of Fontainebleau. She questioned her lover about this matter. The Marquis Monardisi, either because he was too confident or too naive, actually argued that he was not the one who betrayed the former queen, and swore that if he was a traitor, he would die. Such words undoubtedly made Lady Christina hate and angry. She immediately produced all the evidence and sentenced the Marquis to death. The Marquis was panicked at the time. He knelt down and begged for forgiveness from Lady Christina, but Lady Christina responded by calling the priest who listened to his dying confession and the 2 murderers. The Marquis Monaldese did not surrender, even though he was injured at the beginning because he was unarmed. He ran from the room to the corridor and hastily put on a decorative armor. With this, he fled in various rooms for several hours, from night to dawn, but was finally stabbed to death by Francisco. It is said that because he was wearing armor, he suffered many injuries but they were not fatal. In the end, although he was stabbed to death, it was better to say that he was tortured to death. Even Father Lebel couldn't bear to watch him go on like this. He even knelt down and begged Brother Francisco, but we all know that no matter men or women, They are always the most cruel when facing a rival in love. Francisco showed no mercy, and Lady Christina only asked him to bury the Marquis in the church. She took out a sum of money and asked the priest to hold a penance mass for him. For the French and the Swedes, this is not only a scandal, but also a crime. Now Lady Christina is waiting for the final judgment. It depends on how Louis decides. Louis still needs to discuss this matter with Bishop Mazarin, because as mentioned above, Sweden can be said to be a country that the French have continuously supported in order to restrain the Holy Roman Empire. Bishop Mazarin even thought about taking it into his pocket through marriage, but now it seems impossible. So, should he make the current king of Sweden unhappy for Lady Christina? This requires more consideration. So for yourself, said the bishop, which side do you want to lean towards? Lady Christina. The king said. Is the reason the same as your unwillingness to accept Cromwell? You can say that. Then let it be, said the bishop. This matter was settled. Louis wanted to know what the bishop was thinking. Yes, if the lady was not sent to a monastery, the king of Sweden would be dissatisfied. But if the lady was still alive, she and her descendants would still be a threat to the king. After all, Sweden had been passed down from father to son by the Vasa dynasty since Charles IX, except for the descendants of rebellious and deposed kings. There is no need to say more about the subsequent trial. According to the records of Lady Christina and the attendant, the lawyer who defended the former Queen of Sweden said that she had the right to judge her subjects, even though she had abdicated. As a queen with a strong sense of responsibility, although she had abandoned this noble status, she was still a queen in thought and soul. Therefore, her execution of the Marquis of Monardisi, a traitor, was completely legal. René Descartes' request got the best result. Chapter 87 Lonely Mary. In the 30 Years' War, France was defeated in Corbie, but won in Rocroi, Arras, Reims and Perpignan. Unfortunately, due to years of civil unrest, such a victory was shattered. The reason why Bishop Mazarin was unwilling to give up Cromwell, the rebel hated by the king, was because he intended to pull Britain towards France. However, Louis never had a good impression of Cromwell. After all, in the hearts of people at that time, the king's power was granted by God, and Cromwell was bad because he did not have a suitable successor. Now England and Ireland almost entirely rely on His Majesty and past achievements to maintain a strange balance. Once he was questioned, impeached, assassinated, or died, Britain would be turned upside down overnight. But Bishop Mazarin would not accept these ideas, which Louis felt he could understand. He had only been involved in politics for a few years, and he could be said to be quite emotional in some things. Of course, the Spanish envoys did not come only for the former Queen of Sweden. They were also trying to put pressure on France and find out secrets, specifically targeting the British protector. The Prime Minister of Spain was in contact with Cromwell, wanting to gain the greatest benefits from the protector of the kingdom. To this end, they promised Cromwell that they were willing to help him capture Calais. Calais is a very important city, located between France and Britain, and can be regarded as a gateway to Paris. The Spanish intention is self-evident, and Bishop Mazarin's solution was to put Dunkirk in front of Cromwell. Now Dunkirk belongs to the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. Speaking of which, this city has a very unfortunate fate. It was originally part of the County of Flanders, and later belonged to the Duke of Burgundy as a dowry. The daughter of the last Duke of Burgundy married Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. When Charles V of the Habsburg dynasty once again divided his territory, it fell into the hands of King Philip I of Spain, but for Cromwell, Dunkirk was undoubtedly a bridge connecting Britain and Flanders. To put it simply and bluntly, the Spanish were instigating the British to fight France, and the French were also instigating the British to fight Spain. Cromwell might have noticed it or not, but he was indeed immersed in the pleasure of being flattered by two powerful countries, just like a beautiful lady fought over by two strong knights. Duke Philip of Anjou made such a harsh comment, and Louis laughed out loud, but even the bishop had to admit that he was right. Although Louis did not make any statement, perhaps because the bait thrown by Bishop Mazarin was indeed tempting, Cromwell finally leaned towards France, or it might be because he wanted to seize Mexico from Spain, but was rejected by Spain. However, his generals William Penn and Robert Venable still seized Jamaica Island, Santiago, from Spain. This island is very important, and the British can use it to further expand the route to the New World, so Spain and Cromwell fell into a stalemate. But for Louis, facing such an arrogant person, the most hateful thing is that he really has the capital to be arrogant. It is not pleasant. Cromwell called him my brother in his letter to the king. His secretary signed the treaty first, and the king's plenipotentiary ambassador had to sign at the end. If this is not excessive enough, then he also ordered Louis to cut off relations with Charles II and even expel them as an elder and guide. That was too much? But these are nothing for national affairs and even the whole world. The Spanish people could not get Cromwell's support, so they ordered the Prince of Condé to lead his army to attack Calais. The Viscount of Turin fought with the Prince of Condé in a place called Arras. Turin won, and the bishop went to Arras with Louis. His purpose made Louis not know whether to laugh or cry, because the bishop actually wanted to put this crown of honor on the king's head. Damn it, when the Prince of Condé retreated in embarrassment, they were still thousands of feet away from Arras. Bishop Mazarin and Viscount Turin didn't care. The former never cared about anyone other than the king, and the latter was grateful for the king's complete trust and love, so he didn't mind letting the king serve as an honorary leader. Well, if it was just an honorary leader, Louis accepted Viscount Turin's kindness, but in front of the people, Viscount Turin's contribution was not erased. This was Louis' last insistence. What they didn't notice was that Sebastian Vauban, who was serving under Viscount Turin, seemed to have discovered something and understood something. But that's all for the future. The king and the bishop were in Arras, and in the Louvre in Paris, there was only Queen Mother Anne and those we were familiar with. The court without the king was dead silent. Because of the previous incident, the former Queen of Sweden, Lady Christina, stayed in Fontainebleau and rarely went out. Because Cromwell's letters were eventually leaked, the Queen Mother of England, Mary, and Princess Henrietta, no longer appeared in front of the public easily. Instead, the Duchess of Montpensier and her female companions often appeared beside the Queen Mother. Mary Mancini was not happy about this, because the Duchess of Montpensier was said to be the first person to be considered as a candidate for Louis' wife. Although she no longer had this qualification, she was indeed the first among the noble ladies in the court except the Queen Mother. Similarly, the Duchess of Montpensier did not like Mary. Everyone knew that Bishop Mazarin was of humble origin, and the family his sister married into was ancient, but it was only one of the many low-level nobles in Italy. As for wealth, who could be richer than the Duchess of Montpensier? What the ladies hated the most was that Mary Mancini was clearly trying to take the king for herself, and no one could get a share of him. But even the future queen might not have such qualifications, let alone a foreign woman who had no title so far. When Felipe Mancini was executed for an unspeakable crime, the king promised 3 prominent marriages to the daughters of the Mancini family in order to appease the bishop, which made people even more angry. Because the king had mediated between Mary and the Duchess of Montpensier before, the ladies would not want to offend His Majesty, but they could isolate and ignore Mary. The Queen Mother also noticed this, but because of Felipe, the Queen Mother did not hesitate to vent her anger on Mary. Even if she was right next to her, she would not speak to her, and of course she would not order her to do anything. Even if Mary boldly requested to know about Louis's news, she could not get any response. Also, Mary thought that her father would punish her severely for Felipe's matter, either by insulting or beating her, but no, she seemed to have been forgotten by her father. Her uncle also did not see her again, even though he often came to see the king. Mary, hiding herself in the curtain, raised her hands, hugged her knees, and buried her head between her legs. There were more than hundreds of nobles and servants in the palace, but she was always alone. Chapter 88 How the King Compensated Mary Mancini, Part 1. This was the second day after Louis returned to Paris. He was a young man, so although he was tired from the journey, he had fully recovered by the afternoon of the second day. When Philip came to see him, he was busy sorting out the harvest this time, a long list of names, but the king had to admit that in this era, almost everyone who deserved praise had a good surname, or at least a good family background. The truly poor and destitute could not receive an orthodox and systematic education. Some important books were almost all written in Latin, for example, many works of ancient Roman scholars and military strategists. In this case, how could one learn from these respectable people without mastering Latin? But an ancient surname also represents a complex relationship between people. Louis no longer needs ministers like Condé. To be precise, starting from his father, he has deliberately favored those who were not of prominent family backgrounds and therefore had to rely entirely on the king to survive, such as Richelieu and Mazarin. When Philippe walked into the room, the king had already closed the booklet and put it in the drawer. "Are you here to make an appointment with me when to go hunting in Boulogne or Vincennes?" the king asked. It has been raining in recent days, and it is not pleasant to walk in the forest on a wet day, but I heard that it will be sunny in about a week. Although the weather will be a little cold by then, the prey in late autumn will be unusually plump. What's the matter? Louis noticed something strange about his younger brother. In fact, the king wanted to take Philippe with him to Gasses this time, but the bishop was determined not to do so, and the queen mother was also unwilling. Considering the ever-changing battlefield, if his younger brother was with him, it might indeed cause the extinction of the direct line. At that time, the Duke of Gaston would be so amused, so Louis did not force it. No, it's not that. Philip adjusted the lace on his lapels, although they were already very neat. Did you notice Miss Mary? What's wrong with her? Louis asked. Please forgive him, as a man with a straight mind. It would be difficult for him to discover the problems like Mary's if they were not put in front of him. After all, Mary could come and go in his study at any time, but she never mentioned it. Louis naturally thought that Mary's thinness and paleness were entirely caused by missing her. Not only did he indulge her in his study, he also often took walks with her in the moonlight or sunset, admiring the green trees and flowers in the Tuileries garden, and feeding sparrows and crows with torn bread to the sound of the small fountain. So Philip told the king about some of the things that happened to Mary Mancini. Louis was even a little surprised after listening. I thought you would hate her. After all, Felipe was Mary's brother, and if the king had not acted anxiously and fiercely, Mary might have really remained silent about the matter, but Philip just shook his head. I don't blame her, he said, and I know you like her. The prince said, when you are with her, you are very relaxed and happy. Louis was silent for a while. Yes, he admitted, I really like her very much. In the intrigue, madness and absurdity of the court, and even in the whole world, Mary Mancini's love is sincere and frank. When he is with her, Louis needs to think very little. Sometimes, he almost forgets that he is still a king, and his country is still occupied and divided by thugs, rebels and wizards, dark creatures in the church. And even if I hate Mancini, the prince said coldly, her ending will not be enviable, brother. She loves you, but she can only be your dishonorable lover at most. You will have a princess as your wife, and she will have a prominent husband. The more she loves you now, the more miserable and desperate her fate will be. I don't know whether you are laughing at Mary, the king said softly, or blaming me. I will never blame you, the prince said, nor will Mary. She knows what she will face. You have reminded her, right? Yes, Louis said, you can use it as an excuse for prudence. The prince didn't say anything else. He just shook his head and left. He has become more mature since the Felipe incident. The king thought about how to make Mary regain the respect of the ladies. Of course, there is a quickest way to solve this problem, that is to make Mary his true lover. The walls in the palace also have eyes and ears. These ladies can exclude or laugh at Mary before she gets the king's favor, but if Mary really becomes the one who can influence the king's decision, then she will become the object of people's flattery. But Louis could never make up his mind to do so, because once he embarked on this path, Mary could never turn back. When people talk about her, they will always say the king's lover. For a specific example, you can refer to the old Princess of Condé, Lady Charlotte de Montmorency. She was the lover of Henry IV. People's whispers followed her to her grave. When she was alive, she didn't know how much she suffered from her husband and son, and she couldn't rest in peace when she died. Unless she never leaves the court and but Louis also said that he couldn't believe himself. Even if he could keep his love for Mary, he wouldn't necessarily give her power forever. He also realized that Mary's education and her thoughts were not suitable for the dirty court and political situation. The power he gave her would only become a sharp blade to stab her or him, but not her armor. But now, although the ladies in the court were quite consistent in isolating Mary, they always kept their eyes on her because she was now one of the women closest to the king. In addition to the Queen Mother and Princess Henrietta, after hearing that the king had deliberately set aside a whole day to summon his royal barber, jeweler, and many tailors, and was only with Mary Mancini, and intended to dress Miss Mary for tonight's celebration banquet, even the most calm ladies couldn't help but show jealousy. But none of them knew what the king was going to do, especially the barbers. At that time, barbers were men's only, just like saddles, trousers and swords. Women's hair was usually taken care of by familiar female companions or handed over to maids. The way they were handled was also very simple. According to the requirements of the church, women should show humility and piety, as well as indispensable chastity, and should cover all their hair under the headscarf, not revealing a single hair, so as not to easily fall into the devil's trap. It's late today, and a little less. I will make up for it with 2 updates tomorrow. The latest novel is published first on Am Louis XIV. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89: How the King Repaid Mary Mancini, Part 2. What did the king want to do? Of course, it was what he had always wanted and had always done. To make money. Although it was also to comfort the little witch who always stood by his side. It cannot be said that one thing can only achieve one purpose, right? The king's personal barber could also be said to be half a personal doctor. After all, in this era, people were keen on using bloodletting to treat all diseases, from depression to hemorrhoids, from dysentery to syphilis. It was a universal panacea, a wonderful countermeasure, and the best comfort for patients. So when Louis firmly refused, fortunately, when he started to fall ill, he was already able to speak freely and be respected. His personal barber was very frustrated. He didn't understand why the king would reject this wonderful universal therapy. For them, and most people, bloodletting was just the most common treatment method. Not to mention patients, even some healthy people would bleed from time to time to ensure that the 4 important body fluid components of their blood, black bile, yellow bile, and mucus were not out of balance. Just like a certain lord, he would regularly let his most beloved children bleed for him, and he would lose nearly a pint of blood, nearly 500 milliliters, every month. Only the barbers on the street, whose status was higher than that of butchers and lower than that of doctors, were able to get involved in such a noble profession because doctors were unwilling to do such despicable and dirty work. In the barber shops of Paris, there would be no window without a few bowls of blood to attract customers, even if this advertisement, which was always surrounded by flies and rats, was banned due to the king's request. They would wrap blood-stained gauze on the doorposts to tell customers how excellent their skills were and how busy their business was. And customers would always happily enter the dark shop to cut their hair, trim their nails, pull out bad teeth, replace fresh teeth pulled from the mouths of the poor, and then bleed. Of course, a skilled barber, in addition to bloodletting, would also be able to amputate, cupping, also a form of bloodletting, leeches, same as the former, cut open abscesses. Sometimes, according to the doctor's or the customer's request, he would taste blood, feces and urine to see if the person had other diseases. Sometimes more responsible doctors would do this personally. But the king did not. Apart from cutting his hair and trimming his nails, he did not allow his barber to touch him. The barber had done his best to dress himself according to the king's preferences, mainly cleaning. His hands were clean and always rubbed with almond cream and olive oil to ensure that they were soft as cotton and exuded fragrance. He sprayed perfume on his body, of course, and took a bath a day before the king summoned him, risking typhoid fever. But the king did not seem to care how much preparation he made. His chamberlain and first chamberlain, Bontang, stood beside him while he was cutting the king's hair, watching his every move and secretly warned him that if the king was even scratched a little, someone would come to chop off his hands. He was not even allowed to bring his own scissors and nail clippers, but had to use the ones provided by the king. The barber was wronged. But today seemed different. The king's attendants asked him to bring all his tools, and then his apprentices. He had 2 sons who were also apprentices, and he brought them all. They carried the boxes for their father and master, got on the carriage, and when they arrived at the palace, they were both surprised and panicked. The older one even stumbled and almost fell. Bontang watched coldly, but the youngest one was very calm, and judging by his lively eyes, he was not frightened or at a loss. They were the first to be brought to the king. What surprised the barber was that there was also a beautiful girl here. She had long black hair and creamy skin, which did not match the light blonde hair and pale skin that were popular in the court. She looked a little uneasy, but the king held her hand, so the barber immediately guessed that this might be Miss Mary Mancini, who was said to be favored by the king. He hurriedly stepped forward and saluted respectfully, and his sons did the same. "I asked you to come here today," said the king, "to do something for me. It's my honor and my expectation, Your Majesty. Please give me your orders and I will do my best. I hope you can follow my request." Louis reached out and touched Marie's hair, and make an exquisite hairstyle for this lady. This request made the middle-aged man in his 40s hesitate. As mentioned before, barbers are only for men, but he had had enough of the king's cold treatment, so he agreed without hesitation. The first thing he had to do was to curl Miss Mary's black hair. The practice of curling hair can be traced back to ancient Egypt, when women would roll their hair around wooden sticks and then apply alkaline mud containing a large amount of borax. After drying in the hot sun, they would knock off the mud and wash off the attached dust, and the hair would then have beautiful curls. Their men would also use irons to make their hair and beards have an enviable curve. The ancient Greeks would also use cloth strips to wrap their hair, and the wealthy ancient Romans would use an empty copper tube with a hot metal stick inserted in the middle to curl their hair. The king would of course prefer to use cold perm to deal with curly hair. Unfortunately, the most basic chemical solution has not been invented yet. At this time, people most commonly used tinders, but tinders are also dangerous. The ancient Roman method is worth applying. So the king asked his royal barber to use the method of rolling the hair on a hollow mailbox and inserting a hot metal rod into it. This method is slow, but safe. Mary sat in front of the window with plenty of sunshine, with her hair wrapped around the mailbox, unable to move, and had to maintain the same posture for a long time. But Louis was beside her, reading documents, talking to her, and feeding her honey water, candied fruit or any snacks that girls like from time to time, making this long punishment not only not painful, but even too short because of excessive happiness. When Mary's hair from the shoulders down had become beautiful curls, the king asked a barber to comb them up, but all the curls had to be fluffy and neat, and then there had to be room for diamond hairpins to be inserted between the crown-like curls and the tied hair. At this point, the barber found himself more clumsy than ever, because he really didn't dare to touch the hair of the king's lover, and Mary was also very nervous. Her back was arched, her shoulders were shrugged, and her neck was stretched forward unnaturally. The barber tried several times but failed, and almost ruined the curls that he had made with great difficulty. He was sweating all over, and when he saw the king frowning unhappily, he didn't know where to put his hands. He wanted his eldest son to replace him, but his eldest son held a wooden box and shook his head desperately. At this time, his youngest son stepped forward and asked clearly, "Can I do it, father?" The royal barber hesitated. He didn't intend to let his youngest son do it. His youngest son was only 12 years old this year. Although he had been learning from him for some time, he was a noble man. The king was beside her, and there was no room for error. "You do it," Louis said. So the youngest son of the royal barber took his place. His hands were small and soft, and because he was only 12 years old, barely a child, Marie's body slowly relaxed. It took him several attempts to fulfill the king's request. Fortunately, the young man was careful and serious, so only 1 or 2 curlers were messed up and they just needed a little tidying up. When all the hair was tied up, the king took out a row of diamond hairpins. He had taken apart several Louis XIV's coats to piece them together. He carefully inserted the 12 hairpins on top of the curlers, and then the flowers made of lace and satin. Mary now looked like a fairy walking out of the dense forest, wearing a gorgeous wreath on her head, and the diamonds in the wreath were sparkling dew. Chapter 90 How the King Repaid Mary Mancini, Part 2. Of course, such a hairstyle could not be covered with a scarf or a hat. Similarly, it must also be matched with corresponding gorgeous clothes and jewelry. So after the barber and the king left, the maids dressed Mary with a full set of jewelry and clothes like a bird holding a flower. Similarly, today's dress was also adjusted by the king. The chest expanded to both sides of the shoulders, revealing part of the collarbone. A thumb-sized diamond was hung under a short pearl necklace. At this time, most diamonds were cut using the emerald method, but the diamonds here, from hairpins to pendants, all used the olive point cut method required by Louis, so that the glitter at the corners was extremely high, almost blinding. But there were no rings and earrings, so that it was in line with Mary Mancini's identity. After all, Louis just wanted to show her importance to him, not to further destroy her reputation. In the court, it was quite rude to wear more luxurious clothes than the superiors. If someone was too exaggerated, not only would it cause dissatisfaction among the princes and nobles, but they would also be ridiculed as unsophisticated, frivolous and stupid. Later, there were rouge and mirabilis powder that Louis copied based on his limited but definitely profound memories. Perhaps no one knew where mirabilis powder came from in the first place, but Louis still remembered that its origin was in America, and now France occupies extremely vast land in America, so it was not difficult to get some mirabilis. He even started planting these flowers in Versailles a few years ago, but it was not until this year that their seeds produced enough powder for sale. Compared to the lead powder that women use more now, mirabilis powder not only does not harm the body, but also nourishes and whitens the skin. It is also more delicate and has a natural fragrance. Rouge should also be mentioned here. No matter in which era, or in the East or the West, people have never concealed their enthusiasm for the color red. Even though red represents sin in Catholicism, people still rush to put on red clothes, from holy garments to women's skirts, to show off their status and wealth. The red pigment familiar to the French originally came from the Ottoman Empire. The main ingredient of this red is madder, and the auxiliary ingredients are cow dung, ox blood and olive oil. It smells touching. Even so, European craftsmen, France even has a dyers' guild, have not been able to replicate it after hundreds of years of experimentation. There is also the blood of St. John in Armenian red, the main ingredient of which is a rare insect. Of course, one can imagine how small their output is. The red velvet coat worth 500 livres that Mr. Fouquet presented to the king probably cost 300 livres on its color. But if possible, the king would rarely choose red when choosing the color of his clothes, except for the shoulder straps. This was the color chosen by his father, and there was no way to change it. It was not for other reasons, but because the red dyes dedicated to the king now almost all came from Spain. One of France's enemies, one of their servants brought back a dye called cochineal from America. The small insects growing on cacti brought endless wealth to Spain, so much so that people also called them red gold. Louis did not want to make France's enemies richer, so the court, which operated according to the king's preferences, gradually withdrew from the court, except that women had to use it to make rouge. Although Louis felt regretful, he was also trying to attract more scholars to France. He remembered that the emergence of chemical pigments was not far away from now. Who knows when it will suddenly appear? As long as he is willing to support it, this is why he values René Descartes. Although the church and conservatives do not like him, he is the king among scholars. If he is willing to teach formally at the University of Paris, some outstanding talents will fly to France like moths to flame. Finally, it was Bontemps' whispered reminder that brought back the king's thoughts. At the moment the door opened, although almost all of this was done by himself, Louis still showed a surprised smile. She was so beautiful. If, before entering the room, Marie was still a beautiful little girl, a bud waiting to bloom, then now she has revealed her grace. The rose rouge from Versailles swept away her previous gloom and became lively and full of hope. The light green coat dress that the king specially chose for her was also embroidered with pink roses, just like the silk flowers that Marie wore on her head. They reflected each other and echoed each other. They smiled at each other and could hardly take their eyes off each other, just like any couple in love. At the dance before dinner, the king danced the basting with the Duchess of Montpensier, and then the minuet with Henrietta. During the gavotte, the ladies were guessing who the king would choose as his partner. Louis took a pink rose from the water bottle beside him and inserted it into the second buttonhole, then walked towards Marie. Marie raised her head, walked out happily, and walked into the hall hand in hand with the king. The jealous eyes still pierced her like thorns, but she was no longer afraid. The gavotte originated from the folks. In the court, the gavotte became complicated and regular, but the overall atmosphere was still relaxed and happy. Or, it was the king who rarely showed the vitality that only people of his age would have. The Queen Mother was not unhappy to see this scene. Louis was the child she and Louis XIV had after 23 years of marriage. He was born with great expectations, especially her and the bishop. She wanted to say that she didn't like Marie Mancini, after her child was hurt by her brother, but when Louis told her that he would choose Marie as his gavotte partner, she knew that the child's idea might not be changed. The problem is, Marie Mancini is still a virgin. The Queen Mother's eyes were always sharp. She looked at the bishop who was right beside her. The king doesn't want to hinder her future marriage. The bishop said. The custom at that time was indeed like this. Generally speaking, those prominent people would find a husband for their lovers. This was very common, and the husband was always sensible. Unless the former's love disappeared, or the big man died, they would never ask their wives to fulfill their obligations in marriage. Sometimes, they would deliberately run far away. So I said. The Queen Mother clapped her hands with a closed fan. Bontemps said the king had changed his clothes in the morning and he was in good health, said the bishop. Well, said the Queen Mother helplessly, I will take it as it is, but you have to make the arrangements, even if it's not Marie. The latest novel is published first on Liu 9 Shuba. Chapter 91 Military Expenditure en Rouge. As mentioned before, the French and Spanish prime ministers were trying their best to win over a rebel, the protector of England and Ireland, Cromwell, just because he had a powerful army and dozens of generals who obeyed him. However, due to his previous behavior, executing a king and exiling a king, in this transaction, neither King Philip of Spain nor King Louis of France showed up directly or had handwritten letters. It was either Don Louis of Spain or Mazarin of France who came and went. It was precisely because their exchanges were not public that we now do not know what Cromwell thought at the time. We only know that he finally chose the French, but relatively speaking, he did not ask for nothing. Every soldier he sent out wanted a salary. However, since the Protector had made a decision, the battlefield would naturally not be in Calais, but in Dunkirk. Here we have to mention the familiar Prince of Condé and Viscount of Turenne. These two people who were close friends in the Battle of Vieurtel became mortal enemies here. Condé knew Turenne, and Turenne also knew Condé, so their war in Flanders was like two carpenters sawing a big tree, coming and going, often over and over again. Not long ago, Condé, with the assistance of Austrian Marshal Don Juan, broke through the defense line of Marshal Laferte and captured the poor nobleman, but in a blink of an eye, Viscount Turenne integrated this defeated army, counterattacked the Spanish army and captured a city, which is rare in military history. However, in less than a year, Condé made a beautiful counterattack in Cambrai. This time he not only thwarted Viscount Turenne's siege plan, but also defeated his army. If we must say something else that allows people to get a glimpse of the truth and choose the winner to bet on, it may be what kind of power and support the King of Spain or France is willing to give to these two outstanding military geniuses. In this regard, the King of Spain must not be able to compare with the King of France. Although it is common for nobles of one country to serve another king and even bear the titles of two countries at this time, Condé was, after all, an enemy general who had fought against Spain for many years. The king could naturally be generous, but the soldiers might not be able to. Condé could certainly gallop and strategize on the battlefield, but when it comes to how to control these subordinates who were once enemies to the point of being able to use them as if they were his own arms, it is another difficult task. Compared to Condé, Viscount Turenne had fewer constraints, or rather, the king gave him no help and trust. After forming an alliance with Cromwell, his general Robert Blake led the British fleet to blockade the Spanish coast and important ports, cutting off all commercial exchanges between Spain and the West Indies. During this period, an important transport fleet was intercepted. This ship belonging to the King of Spain was loaded with jewels and gold, with a total value of more than 4 million livres. For Spain, this was a serious blow, because the gold from the colonies was prepared for the upcoming war. At the same time, the British fleet also had 20 ships heading to Dunkirk, carrying 6,000 experienced soldiers, joining the French army. At this time, Condé and Marshal Don Juan had to lead their troops back. After all, Dunkirk was more important to Spain than the 2 ships of gold. What faced the Bishop and Louis was the urgent need for money to satisfy Cromwell's insatiable appetite. Mr. Fouquet had sophisticated means of making money, but the king did not want to indulge him too much, because the financial director was best at lending. This method could indeed make up for the deficit on the books as quickly as possible, but to Louis, it was like drawing blood from the human body and then injecting the blood into the body. For a moment, it seemed to make people look energetic and full of blood, but in the final analysis, the previously lost blood was not replaced. On the contrary, in this process, Mr. Fouquet took the opportunity to take a few sips. The king wanted to target the nobles and ladies in the luxury goods business, and as soon as Mary Mancini appeared in the hall, she attracted everyone's attention. The hairstyle, decorations and clothes that would be commonplace hundreds of years later struck people's hearts like thunder at this time. Beauty is unified in many cases, unless it is distorted for political or other purposes. Even if there are jealous people who are unwilling to admit it, the king personally invited Miss Mary Mancini to dance the gavotte, and heard that this outfit was all from the king's instruction. Those sour and strange words immediately turned into envy and compliments. Not to mention, when the king came to her holding Miss Mancini's hand, the Queen Mother said to Miss Mancini kindly, "What a beautiful little rose this is." This ended her unilateral cold treatment of Mary. The next day, the king saw that from the Duchess of Montpensier to the lowest maid in the palace, no one covered their hair with turbans anymore, but curled their hair like Marie did. This shows how much weight power and wealth can play in beauty. For example, The Duchess's curls were as beautiful and elegant as those Greek statues, but as for the maids, Bontemps could not help but issue an order not to use the charcoal in the fireplace to roast their hair. The air was filled with a stench of burnt flesh, and their curls were not only messy and of different sizes, but also had many broken and yellowed areas. If anyone still remembers the youngest son of the barber who volunteered, the family name is Champagne. When his father was the king's personal barber, people referred to the craftsman who was lucky enough to be allowed to touch the king's hair. After Marie Mancini shocked the court with her beautiful and unique hairstyle, people referred to the little Champagne. He became famous overnight because he was even more arrogant than his father. If you wanted him to make a hairstyle like that for you, you had to pay him every time 500 livres for travel expenses, and the satin roses, camellias, diamond hairpins, or other precious accessories that this little Mr. Champagne used for his hairstyle were not to be refused. Once refused, he would immediately turn around and leave. In this way, the gold Louis used for each hairstyle could even fill a small box as big as a pair of hands. Even so, the ladies still flocked to him. After all, the hairstyles made by this little Mr. Champagne were so beautiful that as long as it didn't rain, they would only ride in an open carriage so that passers-by could appreciate and admire them. Moreover, the king has been holding balls recently. In addition to the noble ladies invited according to etiquette, there is also Marie Mancini. Almost all of the people he invited have extremely unique ideas. Although the king knows that this is all the masterpiece of Mr. Champagne, or it is some suggestions he gave to Mr. Champagne, he will definitely admire it. After the rumor that Mr. Bishop intends to select a royal lady for the king's spread, each noble lady has a different hairstyle at each ball, and it is getting more and more exaggerated and gorgeous. When the king dances the gavotte with other gentlemen, he needs to turn his head to avoid the flowers and feathers on the ladies' heads. The special tax paid by Mr. Champagne to the king is enough for the early stage of the war. Women are terrible, Louis said. This sentence was heard by Marie, who was sitting at his feet. It was inevitable that she made a dissatisfied voice. The king had to make concessions again and promised to go to Versailles with Marie before going to Dunkirk, alone, just the two of them. Chapter 92, Mirabilis of Versailles. In fact, in addition to the gold that Mr. Champagne combed out from the ladies' hair, the king's purple jasmine powder and rose rouge also sold for a good price, because the production of these rouges was not very high, so with the help of noble ladies such as the Duchess of Montpensier, they sold for a very high price, and these prices allowed the king to get 20 cannons, but he had any guilt? Of course not, compared to lead powder. Purple jasmine powder and pink rose that can moisturize and whiten the skin are much safer than the lead powder and cochineal commonly used by ladies nowadays. Even for health, ladies should pay this tax. The king also had to admit that he did prefer young people, like Colbert, Sebastien Vauban and Champagne. Although their professions and identities were very different, their courage and loyalty were the same, and what Louis lacked now was such a minister, and Marie. The court of Paris now revolves around the king, just like the stars revolve around the sun, but Louis has not forgotten how he was ignored and treated coldly a few years ago. At that time, the noble ladies preferred to gather around the Queen Mother and the bishop. He did not resent them, but it was impossible for them to win the king's favor by flattering him. Before inviting Marie to dance the gavotte, Louis had talked to the Queen Mother. The king could fully understand the Queen Mother's dislike for Mancini, but Marie was different. She saw the king earlier than anyone else, and she only saw the king. In this case, why couldn't the king give her special treatment? The Queen Mother doted on Philip, but she valued Louis. The eldest son rarely asked her for anything, and rarely showed his favor for anything. Since he said so, the Queen Mother would not reject his proposal, which is why the Queen Mother spoke to Marie first at the ball. Louis went to Versailles this time without even bringing his brother Philip. As he promised, there were only him and Marie in the carriage. Marie had hardly been to Versailles since she returned to Paris. She only heard that the king had bought more land to settle a large number of refugees and gave them jobs so that they could support their families. She had vaguely heard about the specific jobs from the king, but when they were still 2 miles away from Versailles, the king opened the curtains, pointed to the flower fields outside the window and told her that this was one of the jobs he arranged for the refugees. Mirabilis jalapa is a plant that can be grown by sowing and growing with seeds, and its seeds are very small and can withstand long-distance transportation, so Colbert used wooden barrels for loading light wine to load these seeds. Some of the refugees were sent to plant potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, etc., and the rest were used to take care of these mirabilis jalapa flowers. This strange plant needs fertile soil, and the swamps that were drained under the king's instruction and sophisticated machinery came in handy. In addition, mirabilis jalapa has very low requirements for manpower. It can almost be said that even without any additional care, they can grow very healthily. Therefore, in addition to the flower fields, even the front and back of the refugees' houses can be seen with the shadow of this flower. After all, the seeds of this flower can be sold for money. The mirabilis jalapa is not actually beautiful. It looks like a small trumpet. It has such a name because it has the fragrance of jasmine. However, some refugees call it the trumpet of an angel. Perhaps for them, this flower that can make them full and healthy is more respectable than the real angel trumpet. Louis knows that they often pick up fallen flowers and put them on the altar of the church. Of course, those that are still on the branches are not allowed. In addition to deep purple, the mirabilis jalapa also has gold, red, and white. Many kinds of flowers are very beautiful even if they are just ordinary individually, but when they are gathered together, the mirabilis jalapa still does not look good even if they are planted in large areas. And by this time, they probably have all produced black seeds. The king took Marie to the other side of Versailles, where pink roses, which are native to France, were planted. "Is this the rose used to make rouge?" Marie asked. "No, these are not enough," the king said. "This is a rose I planted for you, my little rose," he said, picking one and gently inserting it between Marie's curls. Marie had never used a scarf since he asked little Champagne to curl her hair. After walking around the roses for a while and admiring these delicate but vibrant flowers, the king took Marie to climb a hill, from where they could see a group of busy people digging earth. The king told Marie that he would dig a canal here. "For these refugees?" Marie asked in surprise. Louis smiled. "No," he said, he was not so selfless yet. He had this idea because he wanted to build a brand new and grand palace here, but it would inevitably use up a staggering and even desperate amount of money, so this matter was only in his pamphlet, but some preparations could be made now. He could not abandon the refugees who followed him to Versailles, but unlimited support would only produce a group of greedy parasites, and even if people said he was merciful, he did not want people to mistake his mercy for cowardice, so what he provided to these refugees must be work, not so-called kindness. They climbed on their horses and slowly walked towards the construction site. Mary looked at the strangely shaped construction equipment with curiosity. At this time, there were primitive pulleys and booms, but they were not only useful but also dangerous. The workers' safety awareness was also very indifferent. Just as the official in charge of the construction site was constantly bowing to the king, they heard a scream, and then there was a commotion. The king saw a woman running quickly towards the place where the smoke and dust rose. When the dust cleared, they saw a young man lying on the ground with a stone on his feet. "Go and help," the king said, so his musketeer sent several people to run towards the injured worker. However, it was better to say that they came to supervise rather than help, because before they arrived, the worker's colleagues had already broken the stone, but the worker's leg was already bloody and it seemed that there was no way to save him. The woman cried, but she was not very panicked. In the past, people who were injured on the construction site could only rely on luck to save their lives. If they were injured, they would most likely fall into hell. However, Louis could not improve their current working conditions or change their cognition, so it was enough to prepare a sum of money for their treatment and resettlement. Moreover, with the purple jasmine, even if his leg was injured, the young man could still support himself, so his mother, the woman, only worried for a while instinctively, and then followed the stretcher. Mary wanted to give them some rewards, but was held down by Louis. "Don't," he whispered, "if you give money, more people will get hurt intentionally. This kind of thing has happened before. In this era, not to mention the civilians who are in danger of losing their lives, even the nobles are very disrespectful of their lives. On the one hand, they are eager for eternal life in heaven, and on the other hand, they are pursuing a moment of pleasure in the mortal world. Adding the two together, there are so many desperate people." Chapter 93 Power given by the king. After this little disturbance, they went to see the drained part of the swamp in the warm sunset. It was said that the refugees found a lot of fish in it. Although these fish belonged to the king only asked to take away fish larger than 1 cubit. So now the people of Versailles have learned to wrap the small fish with flour and onions and then bake them. This is the dinner for the king and Mary today. With the king's guidance, this fish dish is certainly not bad, and the king's chef has enough fat to fry the small fish first. They slept in adjacent rooms that night, separated only by a door. For a moment, the king wavered. After all, he was already 20 years old, but he still did not let Bontom leave, and Bontom slept on one side of the room, waiting for the king's orders at any time. Late at night, he heard a rustling sound, like a feather sweeping across the floor, and then the door was gently scratched. The king looked at Bontom, the servant who was always alert and would jump up at the slightest movement, except occasionally when he went out to do business, who was bent over with his face facing the wall, motionless. Louis was amused and helpless, so he walked down the bed barefoot and leaned against the small door. He didn't speak, his ear pressed against the door. He heard a nervous breathing sound, and then Louis felt something poking his chest. He lowered his head, and in the bright moonlight, he saw a little finger that was the cutest in the world, which was passing through the keyhole and spinning on his linen underwear. After he stepped back a little, it turned around like a puppy that couldn't find its owner, and then hooked down. Louis couldn't help but stretch out his little finger and touched it. It immediately hooked the king's finger tightly, or rather, the king was trying to hook it, because the little finger exposed after passing through the keyhole was only a short section. The other side still didn't speak, but it was more touching than making a sound. Louis put his hand on the bolt. This door was originally set up for couples. The husband was here, and the wife was in the next room. If they wanted to express their love, they would open the door and sleep together. If the king wanted to see Mary, he just had to open the door and walk in, walk to the depths of the rose bush, and enjoy the velvety petals and rich fragrance. He pressed tightly against the cold door to let it take away his burning body temperature. He pressed so hard that he even felt pain, until the relief on it hurt his body, and the king subconsciously touched the pattern on it, as if it was fate. The scene he saw in the daytime came into his mind. It was the story of Helios, the sun god, and Clytie, the water nymph. Clytie and Helios were once lovers, but because Helios fell in love with someone else, Clytie managed to kill his new love with a borrowed knife, and Helios, the sun god, never met her again. But Clytie's love did not die. She turned into a sunflower, looking up every day to follow the sun, and lowered her heavy head every night. This exquisite relief depicts this story, and it made the king's heart suddenly sober up, because he liked Mary, even loved her, so he could not indulge his emotions. He bent down, kissed the little finger, and pushed it back. Marie on the other side didn't know what to do, but the king didn't sleep well that night. They returned to Paris the next day, and Marie was immediately summoned by the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother was still worried about that matter. Compared with the king, she didn't care about Marie's reputation. Yes, in this era, a husband who was angry because his wife had a lover would be ridiculed, because at that time, marriage, especially for nobles, was mostly for titles, dowries and territories, or for various overt or covert transactions. A husband was angry with his wife for this reason. Either he lacked charm or money and could only seek love in his legal partner, or he really fell in love with his wife. The strange thing is that the latter behavior is not only not praised, but will be despised, because only inferior people will do that. But conversely, a girl should remain innocent before marriage, and after marriage, if she wants to find love, she should wait until she gives birth to the eldest son with her husband, otherwise it will be regarded as dereliction of duty. Therefore, regarding marriage and chastity, two completely different views emerged. In the camp of Prince Condé, the Duke of Longueville was secretly ridiculed by many people for admitting that he knew that the son was not his eldest son, and the Duchess of Longueville also made the Queen Mother quite dissatisfied. However, compared with the behavior of the Duke of Mortimer, marrying a wife purely for love, it was another joke close to a scandal. No wonder he immediately joined the king's army, otherwise his wife and stepdaughter might never have the opportunity to enter the court again in this life. The Queen Mother was somewhat dissatisfied with Mary. Of course, because illegitimate children had no right to inherit the throne according to the inheritance law, she did not mind Mary having close contacts with the king, nor did she care about giving her the title of royal lady. As for Mary's future marriage, there were always people who were blinded by greed and power and were willing to accept such a wife. The king noticed this time, and before another wave of turmoil in the court, he also asked Mary to stay by his side when he summoned the ministers, and deliberately sought Mary's opinions on a few small issues. Later, when Mary hurriedly ran in, the king thought that several priests from the Inquisition were chasing the little witch, but no, as soon as Mary stood in front of him, she nervously and quickly opened a box facing the sunlight. The king's eyes were suddenly blinded by a dazzling light, and he quickly turned his head away. Someone gave me a set of diamond jewelry. Mary gasped, "Your Majesty, it's real diamonds." Louis smiled helplessly. "Is there anything strange about it? Why did he give me this?" Mary shouted, "Merlin, he is not pursuing me." "Of course not." Louis wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes with his fingertips. "Oh, it was so bright. He has something to ask of you." "I don't understand." "There's nothing you can't understand, Mary," Louis said gently. "They all know now that you are someone I value, so they are going to bribe you." "Bribe me?" "They hope you can speak for them," Louis said, "so take it, it's okay." He closed the box and put it in Mary's hand. "You can recommend others to me, Mary. This is the power I give you." Chapter 94 The King Comes to Dunkirk, Part 1. Everyone knew that the king had parted ways with his lover Marie Mancini before going to Dunkirk. Perhaps for Louis, sharing power was the greatest gift he could give to love, and for Marie, these things were not as good as the little rose that the king had put in her hair in Versailles. But the king had to go anyway. Of course, he could hand this matter over to Bishop Mazarin, but of course he would not do that. This power was exactly what he had worked so hard to get from the bishop and the queen mother for several years, so how could he give it up so easily? Marie ran over at the last moment. The king's closeness to her in recent days was not without effect. At least the king's musketeers and cavalrymen immediately retreated when they saw her. She stretched out her hands and placed her slender hands on the gilded frame of the window, her eyes full of tears and regret. "Louis," she whispered, "Louis, you must come back. You must. I will pray to God and ask him to bless you to return safely." Others may not think that praying to God is such a great thing, but Marie's a witch, and the king cannot return such a warm emotion. He can only quickly pull off a ring on his finger and put it on Marie's thumb. "I will come back," he said hurriedly, and then watched Marie step aside with the support of the Queen Mother's lady-in-waiting. The previous behavior was already quite rude. The Queen Mother stood there dignifiedly and gave her eldest son a last glance full of worry and expectation. The king's younger brother, Duke Philip of Anjou, rode beside the king's carriage and sent him to Versailles before returning. Louis fell on the soft seat, pressed his forehead, and sighed. Bishop Mazarin and Viscount Tyrone had been waiting for the king in a village near Dunkirk. This village already belonged to the French. In order to ensure the king's safety, the residents here were forced to move away. Only the king's most loyal soldiers and officers were here. However, because this place was regarded as the king's palace in Dunkirk, Viscount Tyrone, or more accurately, his captain Vauban, rebuilt this village as an important military fortress. Before the king could see them, he saw the bastions, fortifications, the retaining walls outside the trench and the inner trench wall. There was a newly built low wall outside the village, and sentinels walked back and forth behind the wall. As soon as they saw the king's carriage, a man walked out and asked the leading officer for a password. When the sentry heard that it was the king's arrival, he immediately ran back, and then a dazzling red flag and a French flag were raised. A few minutes later, the Vicomte de Tyrone came on horseback, opened the door for the king himself, helped him out of the carriage, bowed to the king, and said, "Your Majesty, please allow me to walk in front of you and lead the way." "That's exactly what I want," said Louis. Then the Vicomte de Tyrone drew his sword, held it in front of him, and strode forward. At this time, the guards and musketeers around Louis had all dismounted, and their hands were on their muskets and swords, because the soldiers were coming out from behind the bunkers, all of them carrying weapons. Just in the next moment, the king heard the sound of drums on both sides, and in the rhythmic drums, a man in Spanish costume came out, holding a key in his hand. "What a small key it is," the king couldn't help saying. "Yes, Your Majesty," said the Viscount of Tyrone proudly, "because it is only the key of this town. The key of Dunkirk is much larger. But it will take some time." "I hope I won't have to wait too long," the king said with a smile. "There is no doubt, Your Majesty. God is my witness," Viscount of Tyrone replied quite confidently. The king took the symbolic key, the soldiers blew the horn, then the drum, and then the soldiers who left the low wall raised their guns to the sky, saluting. Viscount of Tyrone bowed to the king again, and brought a horse for the king. After helping the king to mount the horse, he led the horse to the center of the town, where was the best building here, and it was renovated according to the king's preferences, that is, with toilets and bathrooms. Bishop Mazarin greeted the king here, and he also lived here, because many things needed to be discussed with the king. It was the first time for some soldiers to see the king and his motorcade. The motorcade stretched for a quarter of a mile, which made them curious and surprised. They kept guessing what was in those carriages. The reason they didn't guess that the king's lover was sitting in them was because those carriages were completely closed, leaving no gaps. But they soon found out, because the carriages stopped in the town square, and every item unloaded from them would cause excited discussions among the soldiers. These were the supplies they needed most, from dried meat to flour, from salt, butter to sugar, as well as coffee and tobacco, and even 3 carriages of guns. When the felt cloth of the last 10 open carriages was lifted, the onlookers cheered loudly, because there were nothing else inside but 10 disassembled and properly tied cannons. "We could have had 20 cannons," said the king, "but I think the soldiers' stomachs should also be well armed." "Your Majesty, we all know that soldiers may just run away without gunpowder, but without bread it would be worse than without gunpowder." "But, Your Majesty," Bishop Mazarin said after watching for a while, "how much of this stuff belongs to you?" "Everything," said Louis, "my soldiers, my general, my bishop. I mean your clothes, your accessories, your water bottles and chamber pots." The bishop said, "And your sheets and pillows. Don't tell me you came to Dunkirk empty-handed." "The Queen Mother did prepare a lot of things for me," Louis said gently. "In fact, these carriages were prepared by the Queen Mother. The respectable mother brought his bed with her, as well as a group of attendants and maids, but he left them all in Versailles, along with all the things the king thought he didn't need to bring with him. It can be said that they took less than when they left Paris for the first time because of the riots. If you must describe it, it's probably about the same as what any man brings on a business trip. He is not fleeing because of the riots this time, and there are also trustworthy subordinates here. The king doesn't think he needs to bring those, and he thinks it's enough to bring enough underwear, even if Bonhomme is silently angry all the way. Don't ask Louis how he knows. He and Bonhomme have been together for a longer time than the Queen Mother." Mr. Bishop sighed. The king smiled. "Mr. Bishop," he said, "perhaps you would like to have dinner with me." The bishop could do nothing but bow slightly. "It's my pleasure, Your Majesty." "Don't be upset," said the king. "We found a whole nest of quails on the way here." "Today is Lent," said the bishop angrily. "But when I found them, they were swimming in the pond." "According to the custom, Mr. Bishop, they are fish, and we can eat fish during Lent." "Well, then there must be quails raised by the devil," said the bishop. "I have never seen quails swimming in the water." "In that case, we must eat them all the more," the king said with a smile. "Let them suffer in our gastrointestinal hell." At this point, even the bishop was speechless, and he slipped away on the pretext of praying. When only Viscount Tyrrell and the king were in the study, the king took out a large stack of bills from Amsterdam. Of course, he would rather support French bankers, but these were for the 6,000 British soldiers sent by the Protector Cromwell, because the bills of exchange of the Amsterdam Bank exceeded 600 florins and had to be exchanged in Amsterdam. The king asked Fouquet to convert them all into bills below 600 florins, so as to avoid disputes among British officers on exchange, so there was such a large stack. When Viscount Tyrrell took them, his hands were shaking. "Your Majesty." "Don't thank me," the king said. "Thank the ladies, they are so brave." This was the money from the last batch of purple hyaluropoplin and rose rouge. Knowing that this was the last bit of cosmetics this year, these lovely little boxes and jars were sold at an astonishing price in Paris. It was the first time the king knew that there was such a profession as purchasing on behalf of others in Paris since the 17th century. After the ladies in Paris bought the cosmetics, they kept their own share and sold the rest to people in the provinces at several times the price. It is said that even more distant places have appeared fake king's cosmetics. Of course, after hearing this news, the king sent his musketeers to investigate the matter and confiscated all the illegal gains. "You said in your last letter to me that Cromwell sent to his new model army." "Yes, Your Majesty." Viscount Tyrrell said, "Please come to the window, you can see them training." Chapter 95 The King Comes to Dunkirk, Part 2. Although he could see it from the window, Viscount Tyrrell would not place the British army so close to the king, so the king only saw rows of red dots. They were training outside the town, in the middle of the flat hills. The king took the telescope sent by Viscount Tyrrell and put it in front of his eyes to see the British. They were dressed in uniform, wearing red coats, yellow shoulder straps, gray-brimmed hats and gray trousers, and brown boots. Their ranks were neat and their steps were firm. There was no laughing or slacking, which was much better than the French army. "Are these all infantry?" the king asked. "Yes, Your Majesty." Viscount Tyrrell said. "Mr. Cromwell can really be said to be quite generous," the king said sarcastically, and he returned the telescope to Viscount Turin. "Cromwell's new model army is said to have only more than 14,000 infantrymen, and he is willing to give us nearly half of them. Of course, the price he asks for is quite high." He pondered for a while. "Mr. Viscount, can I ask you to do something for me?" "At your command, your majesty," said Viscount Turin. "I hope you can invite someone for me to the banquet tonight." "Who has the honor?" "The highest commander of this army." Viscount Turin hesitated slightly, because in his opinion, although the officer was also a noble, he was not yet qualified to have dinner with the king, but Louis had already said so, and Viscount Turin, who swore not to betray the king and obey any of his wishes, would not refute it. Just a little doubt. The king also noticed this. He stretched out his hand and put it on Viscount Turin's shoulder, satisfied to see that it was not difficult for him to do this action. "My respected sir," he said, "don't think that I value a foreigner more than a Frenchman." The king comforted. "I just want to know what kind of person he is," and this point, through the conveyance and description of others, may lead to fallacies. "So I must see him with my own eyes. I can boldly ask." "Of course, Viscount," the king explained gently. "You know that the roll of bills I gave you just now is not the full payment to the British." "Yes, your majesty, I heard a little. I must admit that I am always reluctant to admit that Oliver Cromwell's pseudo-rule has caused some troubles to our bishop." The king pointed to the bills of exchange. "So these can be said to be additional rewards instructed by Cromwell to his envoys. The British's initial and unchanging demand from beginning to end is Dunkirk, this city." Viscount Turin was silent for a few seconds. The king saw a look of shame on his face, and then he realized that the general had misunderstood what he meant. Of course, for Viscount Turin, a genius in the army and immortal in politics, it is indeed a shame to need the help of another country's army to seize a city that originally belonged to France, but the king will not blame his generals for this. As the saying goes, the best hunter cannot catch a fox without horses and dogs, without soldiers and officers. No matter how perfect Viscount Turin is, he cannot conjure up enough troops. He is not God. What I mean is, the king affectionately placed his hand on the back of the elder who was old enough to be his father. "Mr. Viscount, these 6,000 soldiers are for both capturing Dunkirk and occupying Dunkirk. Your majesty, when we capture Dunkirk, according to the agreement, it will belong to the British." Of course, Cromwell chose France over Spain and us because he believed that Spain was now Britain's biggest enemy. Before Dunkirk became a nail for Britain to cut into Flanders, it was a port and fortress for Spanish privateers, and as you know, most of the prey of Spanish privateers were British fleets, so he had to win Dunkirk. So, in order to avoid trouble, he must station troops here. Then, what could be more justified and logical than the soldiers of the new model army who achieved significant results in this battle? The king patted Viscount Turin on the back soothingly and said, "I heard that they have handed over the command of these 6,000 soldiers to you. I hope that you can get to know them as well as possible, and master them, especially their officers and generals." At this point, the king said as if talking to himself, "After all, who knows when they will become our enemies again?" Since the king said so, or precisely because he spoke so sincerely to Viscount Turin was bound to complete the task assigned by the king and invite the officer to the dinner. But to be honest, the officer was not willing to accept this honor from the bottom of his heart. The British and the French had been enemies for 100 years, and would probably continue to be enemies. This time they came together to fight against their common enemy, Spain, but no one knew what the future would be like. However, during the time that Viscount Turin had been with them, he had indeed conquered many people with his charm, including himself. Moreover, this time the Viscount also brought a bill of exchange entrusted by the king. He thought he would have to wait until the end of the war, and it might take some time to get it. This made him and his soldiers feel much more at ease. At the very least, if they died in the war, their children and parents would be able to get pensions and salaries. So after hesitating for a while, he accepted the king's invitation and set off immediately. He arrived at the king's palace in advance to show his respect for the King of France. Turin introduced him to the king, and he also saluted respectfully. He might be only a little older than Louis, with a young but serious face, but when he heard his last name, the king asked, "Is George Monk your father or uncle?" "Yes, your majesty." The young gentleman said, "He is exactly my uncle." "How is he now?" "He is now the governor of Scotland." Mr. Monk replied. The king nodded, and they took their seats. Mr. Monk's seat was on the right-hand side of Viscount Turin. Of course, the swimming quail that he had joked with the bishop before was not served. They ate a meal of fresh sea fish, shell-stewed eggs and bread seriously. When Mr. Monk found that the king had been paying attention to his military uniform, he had to ask His Majesty if there was anything he was confused about. "I just noticed that the color of your clothes seems to be different from other officers. Theirs is gray, and yours is blue. Is it because of your position or for some other reason? Of course, if this embarrasses you, you don't have to answer. I'm just a little curious." "Oh," said Mr. Monk, "there's nothing that can't be answered, Your Majesty. The reason why my trousers and hat are blue is that I used to be a personal soldier of Commander Thomas Fairfax. Although he has resigned from his position now, even if it's for commemoration, Your Majesty, I still think of me as his soldier." "You are a loyal man," said the king. Mr. Monk lowered his head humbly and proudly to accept the king's praise. The king's praise for Mr. Monk undoubtedly attracted the attention of Mr. Bishop. There was not much estrangement between him and the king now, so he asked directly during the evening prayer. "It can be said that this young officer is a treasure boy," said the king. Mr. Bishop's expression suddenly became strange. Fortunately, he had recently become accustomed to the king's strange remarks. "Why do you say that?" "Because of his surname. George Monk did hold great power in the British Parliament and the army, but after he suffered several setbacks against the Royal Army, Charles I's army, he had to retire to Devon. Later, Oliver Cromwell felt that he was still trustworthy and insisted on promoting him to the position of fleet commander, and won a great victory in the First Anglo-Dutch War. Now he was at the peak of his glory, and even his sons and nephews could not be bribed by the French." "No, I don't have that plan," Louis said. "The surname Monk is indeed worthy of our attention, but I am concerned about Fairfax. He voted against the decision on whether Charles I should be executed, and his position was clear. He is now living in the countryside in retirement. Since he can leave, he can go back." Louis turned around. "If Thomas Fairfax can return to the center of power in Britain, then Cromwell will be troubled." In 1640, Cromwell was just a country squire councillor, and Fairfax had inherited his father's title and was a baron. When the new model army was established, he was the commander-in-chief, and Cromwell was only a lieutenant general. His prestige in the army was higher than Cromwell, and so were his victories and experiences. If the cavalry in the new model army were not almost all from Cromwell's supporters, and they fell into Cromwell's trap in the so-called Equality Act incident, and finally, when discussing the issue of the expedition to Scotland, they had a big quarrel with the former and resigned in anger, I am afraid that the person we have to deal with now may not be Oliver Cromwell. But that doesn't mean he intends to restore the monarchy. He maintains due respect for the monarchy. That's enough, Mr. Bishop. Do you still intend to let Charles I get his throne back?" "Yes, Mr. Bishop. But what good will it do us? When France must face an enemy, Mr. Bishop, who would you choose between Cromwell and Charles II?" Louis closed the Bible. "Charles, of course Charles. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelists. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96: The King Comes to Dunkirk, Part 2. The name Dunkirk comes from West Flanders. In Dutch, it means church on the dunes. With such a name, the topography of the city can be imagined. When Viscount Turin followed the order to take the king and the bishop to inspect the army, the scene they saw was not spectacular. Looking at Dunkirk from outside the town, it was an old city. Although the Spanish privateers regarded it as a fortress and made a fortune under its protection, they did not value it itself, even the troops stationed here. It stands to reason that the British warships moved to block the route in port a month ago should have aroused their vigilance, but they did not build new fortifications or strengthen the city walls, except opening the sluice gates and flooding the nearby lowlands. The water deposited in the low-lying areas once caused some troubles to the French here, but many of them were farmers from the south and were familiar with swamps and water, so they quickly managed to divert the accumulated water away. Now those places are not a big problem except for being wet and muddy. Under the guidance of Viscount Turin, the king visited their camp. There were about 15,000 people here. It would take 4 to 5 villages to accommodate so many soldiers. Under normal circumstances, This number would be enough to cause a catastrophe to the villages and towns near Dunkirk. As described before, the army at this time was no different from bandits. They were fierce, brutal and shameless, without any moral concepts or shame. According to the convention, the men, the elderly and children of the village would be killed, and the women would become the entertainment of the soldiers and officers. They would exhaust the last bit of food of the residents and burn all the houses when they left. This situation was quite common in France, Britain, and even in two different sects. The Lord said to love your neighbors, and the bishop didn't care if you killed them as long as they were heretics, although Louis never thought that there was any difference between raising 3 fingers and raising 2 fingers, a long cross and a short cross, wine and grape juice. The above were all reasons for launching religious wars. The people here should feel lucky, because the Viscount of Turin knew that their king was kind by nature, so when he accepted the surrender of the mayor of this town, he asked him to provide enough shelter and food for the army. Although the people in those villages still suffered from exploitation and expulsion, they could still keep their lives. When the army left, they would have to go through a very difficult time, but as the mayor said, they would thank God and the king. But Louis or the bishop did not dare to take such flattery seriously. When the king went out, in addition to the musketeers, there were still 2 priests from the Inquisition to protect him. If you still remember, there were always rumors in the court that the Duke of Gaston made a deal with the devil in order to seek the throne of his brother. These demons were hidden in some absurd paintings and brought back. Louis XIV's accident originated from here, and this is the border between Flanders and France. No one knows what will happen. Viscount Turin has heard that ghouls have appeared here. The king had no time to pay attention to these things for the time being. He focused on observing the difference between the British New Model Army and the French soldiers. In addition to the uniform clothing, the New Model Army also had a ruddy complexion and a calmer demeanor than the average French soldiers. They were full of confidence and pride. In addition, they were full of vitality, like a tall new tree, just like Mr. Monk at the dinner. Obviously, they were far superior to the king's soldiers both psychologically and physically. Louis did not like Cromwell, but he had to admit that he was an outstanding leader. When he saw smoke rising from a house, he rode over and saw 3 officers gathering there. Although there was a map spread out on the ground, the family must have taken as much furniture as possible when they left, and the king even saw a blank outline of a spinning wheel on the wall. They should have dice or cards in their pockets, which made the king sigh again. Gambling is almost the only hobby of the French nowadays besides dancing and hunting. In this regard, the new model king is slightly better because Cromwell himself is a rigid Protestant. All kinds of entertainment have been completely banned in Britain, including gambling, so their soldiers never gamble, at least on the surface. Along the way, the king saw that all the soldiers in red coats were spending their free time after training taking care of their weapons and horses. The house occupied by the officers obviously belonged to a wealthy yeoman in the village. It had 2 floors, with bedrooms upstairs and a living room and kitchen downstairs. The walls were made of bricks rather than wood or mud bricks, and there was a fireplace and chimney. There was a hearth where the officers were, and above the hearth hung a funnel-shaped smoke hood, from which the smoke from the burning charcoal could rise to the sky. There was an iron pot hanging on the hearth, and the steam and smoke that the king saw came from here. "Is this your breakfast or lunch, gentlemen?" the king asked. "Lunch," one of the officers said nervously. "Your Majesty, it's lunch for the 3 of us." The king could almost guess why he was so nervous, because in addition to the fresh fish soup in the iron pot, there was also dried meat, black bread, cheese and eggs, and a barrel of ale, which could be said to be quite rich. "What about the soldiers?" Louis asked. "Fresh fish soup and bread too," said the officer. The king believed that he would not be deceived, but compared with a new model army, which had a continuous supply of meat and dairy products, the supply of the French army was not so comforting. The king kept this in mind. Compared with the uniform coats or hats, the soldiers would certainly care more about their stomachs. But after patrolling all the way, the king was still troubled by the mixed clothes of the French soldiers. At that time, people did not have the concept of military uniforms, so everyone wore their own clothes. The regulations of weapons were not uniform. At least there were several types of muskets, most of which were matchlock guns. People who used this weapon could be seen at a glance because they carried a wide shoulder strap with gunpowder bags hanging on the shoulder straps. Pious soldiers generally configured this propellant bag into 12 bags, called the 12 Apostles, and 1 bag of gunpowder could be fired once, bullet bags filled with round lead bullets, and fuse bottles. The gunpowder here was more delicate and used to detonate the propellant. People who use revolver muskets have fewer burdens, because this type of musket uses the friction between sulfur ore and steel wheels to generate sparks to ignite gunpowder, or the newer flintlock. The flint on it can guarantee more than 30 shots, but these guns almost all belong to officers. In addition to being more lethal, they are more gorgeous in appearance. For example, black stocks inlaid with gold are just basic operations, and some people embed gems, pearls, ivory on them. In addition to the appearance, some people have put in a lot of fancy ideas on the function, such as large caliber muskets with muzzles like trumpets, which can be loaded with stones of similar size in addition to lead bullets. Multi-barrel guns, from 4 barrels to 12 barrels. Hybrid guns, no, they should not be called muskets, because they look like knives, axes or shields equipped with a musket barrel. The king could only say that he was very impressed. Viscount Tyrone was not surprised by this, and was even very interested in some of them. Oh, I forgot to mention that, apart from artillery, muskets can only play a role in consuming the enemy's combat power at the beginning of a war. In the end, swords and spears are still the key to the outcome of the war, so whether or not muskets are used, soldiers and officers have swords. Louis made another note in his booklet. Finally, they stood at the edge of the military camp and looked at Dunkirk. Soldiers could be vaguely seen walking around on the grey city walls. Viscount Tyrone allocated part of the army to besiege the city, while the main force stayed here to wait for the Spanish reinforcements. Before the end of the day, he looked at the king several times. Louis knew what he was worried about. Just like any general in battle, he was most worried that someone would intentionally seize his command, but what if that person was the king he swore allegiance to? Especially, Louis is 20 years old, which is the most competitive and self-satisfied age for a young man, and he is not a stupid man, so it is hard to say whether the king will have any views or opinions on the upcoming war. Viscount Tyrone does not care whether the king wants to give him advice. He is afraid that the king is too stubborn. He means that even if he has never commanded a battle, the king will be eager to try and show his outstanding military talent in front of people. Only the devil knows whether he has. Because in front of them, the Prince of Condé, who has become an enemy, won a great victory as a commander in his first battle. Louis saw his worry, and the young king couldn't help laughing. No, he said, no, Viscount, I won't interfere in things I'm not familiar with. The bishop is like this, and so are you. You are my arms, and I won't be like a child and tie you up at will. I just hope you can give me a victory. You can, right? Your Majesty. Louis' words made Viscount Tyrone feel ashamed. The man who was old enough to be the king's grandfather blushed, and even spread to his innocent ears. He did have such concerns, but when the king pointed it out, he felt that he really despised his monarch too much. Louis had decided to be a bystander. He was a king, not a general. Even in the current war, the kings often led the army in person, but they could only be a symbol or encouragement to the soldiers. It really depended on Louis' personal bravery to turn the situation around. By then, he would not be far from being a king who lost his country, just like poor Charles II. Then, Viscount Tyrone said, if possible, can you stay here until the battle starts? Louis looked at him. The general's eyes looked at him with sparkling eyes, and his fingers moved flexibly, which meant that the king should not go to the dangerous battlefield. There is a bell tower here, Your Majesty, from which you can have a panoramic view of the entire battlefield. Have you already determined the battlefield? Louis asked. There are not many places that can be battlefields outside of Dunkirk. The bishop said, opening a secret letter and handing it to the king. Prince Condé and the Spaniards are rushing here desperately, in a hurry, Your Majesty. They even abandoned their own artillery. Thanks to your spies. Louis said, whether it is misleading the Spanish to Cambrai, or all the secrets about them. It's hard to say. The bishop said reservedly, I am still confirming some news, Your Majesty, but what is certain is that our Prince Condé is not having an easy time. The Spaniards talk very nicely, but it is not the case in practice. The main power of this army is still in the hands of Don Juan. Of course, he is the illegitimate son of Philip IV after all, and Condé is a Frenchman. How many people are there? About the same as us, but the composition is more complicated. The bishop suddenly paused, because his head suddenly throbbed violently. He pressed his forehead and closed his eyes. Among them are Spaniards, soldiers of Prince Condé, mercenaries of the Holy Roman Empire, and the royal army of the Duke of York. Wait, is the Duke of York the person I know? Louis asked. He had been reading the secret letter and did not notice the bishop's strange behavior. "That's the brother of Charles II," the bishop said in a constant tone. "He has more supporters than his elder brother." The people gathered under his command support his 2,000 soldiers, but they are still under the unified command of Don Juan. As he said this, the bishop deliberately glanced at the king. "This is the disadvantage of having brothers," he said. Louis just looked up and smiled. "By the way," the bishop suddenly said, "I may introduce someone to you in a few days." "Who?" "The person who wrote this secret letter," the bishop said. This sentence really surprised the king. Everyone knows that Bishop Mazarin inherited a spy organization from Bishop Richelieu. 2 consecutive bishops fed them like a pack of hounds, allowing them to grow and multiply to a terrible level in a short period of time. Their tentacles are not limited to France, and even the Ottoman Turkey has been touched. But Louis has never thought of touching this fine web. This is the bottom line of the bishop, just like the throne under Louis. But the bishop said that he would introduce this spy, who was most likely the leader or an important nail, to the king. "Why?" Louis asked. At this time, the pain that made the bishop's eyes black had passed. He raised his eyes and looked at the king. The 20-year-old king was already 5.5 feet. Considering that the French unit of length is longer than that of other countries, 5.5 French feet is basically equal to 5.9 feet. The king is now a tall and strong young man, but he has begun to age. Every time he opened his eyes, the bishop felt that the trumpet of the angel became louder. If he had been worried before that putting power, whether open or secret, in the hands of the king too early would make him do something insane, but the matter of the Duke of Anjou finally allowed the bishop to make the final decision. Regarding the update, because I suddenly found out that this book was on the shelves, originally wanted to be on the 1st of next month, so I didn't save the manuscript. Starting from the 1st of next month, there will be a week of daily updates. It's late today. The daily update is usually at 8 o'clock in the evening. Thank you. Chapter 97, The Battle of Dunkirk in 1658. The bishop's plan was not without reason. Although he had vowed to abandon the secular world, cut off his relatives, and serve God wholeheartedly, we all know that even the most devout priests would care about their blood relatives, not to mention Bishop Mazarin, who was more secular than secular people. Interestingly, he didn't care much about his poor family, but he cared about those who helped him when he was still in trouble, such as the former financial director Particelli Emery, and even the Mancini family, who he decisively invested in when he was about to become successful. He even wanted to introduce the boys of the Mancini family to the court, but as we know, although he did so, poor Felipe was pierced through the chest by the king, and 2 boys, one died in the previous riot, and the other died of illness while studying. Only a few people knew that he died of an infamous murder. So when the bishop found that there was no one to inherit his achievements, he decided to hand it over to someone the king trusted, just like Richelieu before him. In terms of finance, he chose Fouquet in advance, but then he was disappointed to find that the new financial director was not only greedy, but also stupid, and he did not see that the king's indulgence of him was simply trying to hang his neck. Later his sights fell on Mr. Colbert, but this person was not very suitable, or in other words, he could only take on part of the bishop's current work. So who should he hand over the most important power in his hands? There is no doubt that this unknown power is a double-edged sword, whether it is for the controller or the king, until the king decisively killed Felipe. Of course, the bishop did not want to praise this behavior. After all, Felipe's last name is Mancini, but he really didn't like this idiot who always talked big. He just had no choice. After the initial anger passed, when the bishop was finally able to think about this matter calmly, he suddenly realized that the king's handling of the matter at that time seemed reckless, but it was the best way. If the reputation of Prince Philip of Anjou was to be preserved and the impact of this scandal was to be eliminated, the best way was to kill one of them. The king certainly would not let his brother die, so the only one to die was Mancini. Moreover, he did it himself, which also ensured that the bishop could not vent his anger on anyone because of this matter. He could not punish a king. But what made him appreciate more was the king's concession to the Mancini family later. Yes, it sounded a bit frustrating. Although what Felipe Mancini did was enough to make him appear in the courts of the inner world and the outer world at the same time, he was also the eldest son of the Mancini family who had high hopes. Even if he was indeed stupid, some young people could not help but complain and were full of resentment, but the king accepted this matter very calmly. The bishop noticed that he used to complain to Mary, but now he rarely mentioned the Mancini family in front of Mary. Generally speaking, the bishop thought that there were only two possibilities for him not mentioning a name. One was that he thought the name was trustworthy or important enough to be forgiven anyway. The second was that he thought the name was worthless and didn't care to mention it. It was hard for him to think that the king would prefer the first one, but no matter the first or second one, the bishop decided to leave his most important legacy to the king rather than to anyone else. The bishop's generosity really made Louis happy. No one knew better than him how important the intelligence network was. But to build an intelligence network, first of all, you need money, a lot of money, and second, you need time. He didn't have either of these two things for the time being. It was really gratifying that the bishop was willing to gradually transfer the power in his hands to him. He couldn't help but look forward to the gentleman he was about to meet. But the reason why the bishop said he had to wait a few more days might be because the war was imminent. On the eve of the war, any stranger would be regarded as a target that needed to be closely watched. As a spy, he would not be so reckless unless it was a matter of life and death. The day the war started was a sunny summer day. The Spanish and French armies were deployed parallel to the coastline. Louis stood at the highest point of the town, holding a telescope on the bell tower. When the telescope was first invented, it could only see 3 times farther. After an Italian scholar Galileo Galilei learned the technique, he made a telescope a month later that could see 8 times farther, and a few months later it could see 20 times farther. It is said that the telescope he made could see the uneven surface of the moon. The telescope in Louis' hand had a 30-fold range. Here he could see the shoulder straps of the soldiers. He turned the tube and moved from the Anglo-French coalition to the Spanish. From here, it can be seen that the Spanish people still use the customary large square formation, that is, a square formation of about 100 spearmen, with 9 musketeers in each of the 4 corners of the square, and some scattered musketeers wandering in the middle of the square. The king roughly estimated that there were a total of 60 groups of such square formations, which means that the Spanish coalition should have 7,000 or 8,000 soldiers, and possibly some cavalry and reserves, but basically the number is about the same as that of Viscount Turenne. He saw that Viscount Turenne had unceremoniously put the British New Model Army in the front. The bright red coats clearly distinguished them from the others. They did not have an advantage in terrain because the Spaniards occupied the high ground. Although on the beach, this high ground was only relative. Everyone knew that in combat, even the smallest advantage was still an advantage. It could almost be said that it was a convention that the artillery went first. When the artillery roared and the smoke had not yet dissipated, the New Model Army began to attack. Their courage and experience were indeed not comparable to that of the current French army. It took only a few minutes for them to close the distance to the point where they began to shoot at each other. At this time, it was each other's courage that was tested. People often joked that the musket shooting in the 17th century was akin to face-to-face suicide, but this was not without reason. First of all, the hit rate of guns at that time was very poor, so poor that it was considered lucky to hide an enemy out of 100 bullets, and the hit rate could only be guaranteed by dense formations. Secondly, it was impossible to protect oneself by lying prone, holding up a shield, or other means, because at this time, the guns had to be aimed and loaded while standing, not to mention that when attacking, the soldiers had to advance to the beat of the drums and the team flags, instead of staying in one place and shooting. Finally, also because of the limitations of guns, the range of hot weapons at that time was only 60 to 100 feet. At such a distance, it often only took a few seconds to rush to the front of the opponent. Many times, when the ammunition was exhausted or the officers realized that the distance was too close, they would raise their long swords and shout, and all the soldiers would follow him to draw their swords and charge instead of continuing to stand there stupidly and shoot. So the diffused smoke only lasted for a few minutes. The king saw the soldiers in red clothes climbing up the sand dunes like violent ants and rushing towards the Spanish phalanx. The Spanish musketeers immediately hid among the pikemen, and those pikemen immediately put down their spears. From a distance, it was like a porcupine suddenly exploded with thorns all over its body. It was the same in all 4 directions. It was creepy to see it. Seeing this, Louis was not surprised how the Spanish could rely on this phalanx to dominate Europe for nearly half a century. But if the previous shooting was a test of the courage of both sides, then what was presented to people now was the courage of the British New Model Army. They rushed desperately and broke through the front-line pikemen and broke into the phalanx, causing chaos in the phalanx. The soldiers broke up and fled to the bottom of the sand dunes. "Ah!" the king shouted nervously. "What's wrong?" asked the bishop. "Their battle line is too long," the king said, handing the telescope to the bishop. The bishop looked at him with amusement and clenched his fists. He was a young man after all, he thought, while putting the telescope in front of his eyes. In just a moment, the situation on the battlefield changed. A cavalry attacked the new model army's unguarded left wing and swept the battlefield like a massacre. "That's the Royal Army," the bishop distinguished from the shoulder straps and flags, "the Duke of York's army." No wonder, those new model army and the Royal Army are simply mortal enemies. They even abandoned the Spaniards and only cared about entanglement and killing each other. Viscount Tyrone sent cavalry to support, the bishop said again. The king immediately took back the telescope. He saw that the French cavalry wearing bright red shoulder straps had moved towards the most intense battle, while the Spanish cavalry was a step slower. Like the Spanish phalanx, the French Order Knights had also been galloping in Europe for nearly 100 years. However, in the Battle of Pavia in 1525, although the French Order Knights defeated the Spanish heavy cavalry, they suffered a heavy setback from the musketeers of the Spanish phalanx. At that time, the Spanish musketeers were equipped with muskets, a large caliber musket that was enough to penetrate heavy armor. In that battle, the Order Knights suffered countless casualties. However, the Spanish musketeers had been defeated. When facing the British and Spanish cavalry, the Order Knights were still extremely brave. They defeated 2 cavalry in a row and served as the vanguard to guide the French infantry to attack the Spanish battle formation. Now all the colors were mixed together. The king felt dizzy. When he put down the telescope, he found that his back was so tight that it almost hurt. "I'll ask Bonhomme to bring some tea. Take a rest," the bishop said, without trying to persuade the king to leave the tower. Not to mention the king, he didn't want to leave. Note, Louis was born in 38. So I got the age of his brother Philip wrong before. The Queen of Sweden visited in 56, Henrietta was 12, the brother was 16, and the king was 18. Now it's 58, so the king is 20 years old. And the bishop mentioned the king's age before, but I accidentally typed it wrong. I've corrected it. Sorry, sometimes I type too fast and forget it. Chapter 98 Victory at Dunkirk. It was almost noon, and the king and the bishop simply ate some king's bread, which was bread with cheese, ham and fresh vegetables, drank hot sweet wine, and returned to the tower. In less than an hour, the situation of the war changed again. Speaking of it, anyone with military talent knows how important the terrain of the battlefield is to the entire war situation. Generally speaking, they will try their best to understand every hill, plain, and even river and lake on the battlefield. Viscount Tyrone had one more special skill than ordinary generals, that is his understanding of the sea. Don't forget, after his brother inherited the title of Duke of Sedan, like the second son of every aristocratic family, he joined his uncle's army when he was 14 or 15 years old. His uncle was Prince Maurice of the Netherlands. The Netherlands Federation, which would soon become the Dutch Republic, had half of its territory facing the sea, and the navy occupied the vast majority of their army. To say that a Dutch officer knew nothing about the sea would be a big joke that could make people laugh from the 100 Years' War to the 30 Years' War. Not to mention that Viscount Tyrone's uncle, Maurice, was known as a genius. It could be said that he single-handedly resurrected Europe's professional army. This was one of the reasons why Viscount Tyrone truly submitted to the king. He saw many of the excellences that once belonged to Prince Maurice and the king, especially the emphasis on the sense of responsibility and morality of soldiers. Prince Maurice was certainly not reluctant to teach his nephew. Beside him, Viscount Tyrone could be said to have laid the most solid foundation. Among them, Prince Maurice often talked to him about the Battle of Newport between the Netherlands Federation and Spain in 1600. In that battle, although the Netherlands Federation won a brilliant victory, Prince Maurice still believed that there were many regrettable things. One of them was that when they were fighting, the tide suddenly rose, so that both armies had to move. If he had anticipated this in advance, he would have left more Spaniards instead of allowing the Spaniards to continue to retain the military force to harass the Netherlands transportation lines, so that the battle ultimately failed to achieve the results they expected. So before the war, Viscount Tyrone had mentioned this to the king. Although the king was not prepared to interfere with any of the general's plans, it was also for this reason that Viscount Tyrone told the king his entire battle plan in return. He said that he would force, if the Spanish did not do so, the Spanish to line up with them along the coast, and wait until the tide receded. When the battle began to heat up, the tide receded, The Spanish army would expose the right wing, and he would mobilize the cavalry reserve to bypass here and attack the unsuspecting Spanish. And now, just as Viscount Tyrone expected, the sea water glittering with brilliant golden light in the sun slowly retreated into the sea without people noticing, and the stranded fish were still struggling to survive. The French cavalry reserve had already begun to gallop, and the heavy and hard hooves of the horses trampled through the soft sand, leaving deep pits on it, and rushed towards the Spanish army, who were still unaware in the splashing water. They were still immersed in the battle with the main force of the French army. This can be said to be an unexpected and one-sided massacre. When they did not have to face the large-caliber muskets of the Spanish, the lances of the Royal Knights were still able to make countless enemies tremble with fear. When a guy covered in heavy armor from man to horse crashed into the formation, it was no different from a solid iron cannonball, leaving behind a bloody road. Although some officers immediately shouted at the lancers to turn around, it was too late. When the Royal Knights drew their broadswords and attacked side by side with their colleagues who had defeated the Spanish and British cavalry, Prince Condé, who was in charge of the left wing of the Spanish army, realized that the situation was hopeless. He began to call on his soldiers and officers and led them to break out to the right wing of the French army, because behind them was Dunkirk. As long as they came to the city of Dunkirk and entered the city, they could at least keep this part of their existing forces. The Prince of Condé had the right idea. When the king saw the soldiers wearing light maroon shoulder straps running towards Dunkirk from the tower, he could not help but shout. Fortunately, Viscount Tyrone lived up to the king's expectations. He ordered Sebastian Vauban, the king only found out about this later, to lead only 100 cavalrymen and 300 infantrymen to intercept them. This was the disadvantage of being hostile to someone you once worked closely with. After the war, Viscount Tyrone said that he had been keeping an eye on the Prince of Condé because he knew that he was good at both fighting and escaping. Vauban had an outstanding talent for battlefield fortifications. As if in some kind of echo, he was also quite good at defense. He led his soldiers to occupy a long and wide sand dune first, then cut off the wheel frames of the carriages carrying baggage, set up a temporary fortification, and ordered the musketeers to use it to shoot at the Prince of Condé's army. The Prince of Condé was indeed a brave soldier. Like every time before, he led the troops in person. But this time the goddess of luck did not stand by him, but smiled at Viscount Tyrone. The first wave of attack on the Prince of Condé's horse was killed, and he fell to the ground. Several trusted officers dragged him back. In fact, if he was not the Prince of Condé, he might have ended up like his beloved horse. To be honest, if Prince Condé had been given some time, he might have been able to achieve another ending, but there were many people who shared the same idea as him. When he suddenly found himself surrounded by people, all French, the Duke of York of England immediately turned pale and had to abandon the soldiers who were entangled by the new model army and retreated resolutely. As soon as he left, the mercenaries of the Holy Roman Empire followed their tradition, slipping away when the battle situation was unfavorable, leaving the Spanish Marshal Don Juan and the soldiers to persevere, but they didn't last long. At least Prince Condé hadn't been able to break through the Vauban defense line before the French army approached them. The king was not sure that Prince Condé had been captured at that time. When he heard the news, he couldn't help but shout, "Long live!" and waved his hat. Even the bishop couldn't help but reveal a huge smile that was not reserved. The French army's pursuit and annihilation of the enemy continued until the moon rose. The exact number would not be counted until 2 days later. The French and the New Model Army's coalition forces lost about 400 people, most of whom died in the direct conflict with the Spanish phalanx at the beginning of the war. In contrast, the Spanish coalition lost more than 1,000 people, most of whom were British. More than 5,000 people were captured, and most of these people were Spanish. But the biggest capture was the Spanish Marshal Don Juan, who was the illegitimate son of King Philip IV of Spain and a dancer and was highly valued by the king. The other was Prince Condé, a complicated figure. The Spanish marshal met the king accompanied by the Viscount of Tyrone. His manners were impeccable and he was very elegant. He was said to have refused to surrender to the British New Model Army because they obeyed a tyrant, but Louis guessed that this gentleman was more because he did not want to fall into the hands of the British, that is, Cromwell. After all, Cromwell was now fighting with the Spanish. He did not seem panicked, and even expressed his willingness to see the prosperity of Paris with his own eyes. I think he also knew that his father would soon try to redeem him. He was indeed treated as a prince, and his residence, food, and supplies were second only to the king and the bishop. Compared with this Don Juan, the treatment of the Prince of Condé was much worse. After all, he was still a rebel. He was locked up in a simple room, always sitting by the bed with his head down, looking very depressed. "Did he mention that he wanted to see me?" Louis asked. "Not yet," said Viscount Tyrrell, and then he immediately added, "I think it will be soon, Your Majesty." Seeing his nervous look, Louis couldn't help but smile, knowing that the Viscount was worried that he was unwilling to forgive the Prince of Condé. But even if it weren't for the conventions at this time and place, he would not execute the Prince of Condé, or even exile him, because in terms of military affairs, the Prince of Condé is indeed outstanding, and he has some friends and subordinates. There are still undercurrents in France. The king now wants to borrow even the cat's hand, let alone such a commander. "Don't worry," Louis said to Viscount Tyrrell, "you can persuade him slowly. We still have time, I mean, after the capture of Dunkirk. It won't take a week, Your Majesty, just wait and see," Viscount Tyrrell said proudly. This was not an empty statement. Seeing that most of the reinforcements had been wiped out, the defenders of Dunkirk also lost their previous courage and faith. Viscount Tyrrell did not even force the siege, but only allowed artillery bombardment and heavy siege. Dunkirk surrendered a few days later. When the king heard the good news, he was discussing the funeral arrangements for the fallen soldiers with the bishop. The king intended to hold a high mass for them, but the bishop had to remind him that if he did so, it would become a routine. Conventions are conventions. The king was very persistent on this point. He really didn't understand why his mother, Queen Mother Anne, could hold masses for whoever she wanted. Louis could only remember a few saints until now, but why the bishop didn't care about the mass to commemorate and comfort the soldiers who sacrificed for him in France? The presence of a person to interrupt allowed the bishop to breathe a sigh of relief, but the king grabbed the Viscount of Tyrrell. Of course, the Viscount also agreed to hold a high mass for the soldiers. 2-1, the bishop was defeated, but the good news afterwards still made them raise the sweet wine to celebrate together. Viscount of Tyrrell proposed that during the army's entry ceremony, the king should ride in uniform and walk in front. The bishop agreed, and Louis did not refuse, because considering that Dunkirk would eventually be handed over to the British, General Monk of the new model army might have a dispute with Viscount of Tyrrell over who would enter the city first, but if it was the king, then even Cromwell would have nothing to say. The same night, Blois. A painful and rapid gasp came from the heavy curtains, and the Duke of Orleans' servant jumped out of the small bed, lit a candle, held the candlestick in one hand, and opened the bed curtain with the other hand. When he moved the candlelight to the Duke's face, he screamed in horror. Chapter 99 Duke Gaston's Commission. The servant shouted like this because the upper body of Gaston, Duke of Orleans, was almost submerged in blood and gore. His pillows and sheets were covered with sticky, smelly, black and red semi-solidified substances. His nose was gurgling with bubbles coming out of a pile of indescribable black pudding-like substances. The painful gasps just now came from here, but what made him shout uncontrollably was the bulging eyes of Duke Gaston. They were swaying above the eye sockets, like ripe grapes that were about to fall off the branches at any time. Even the bravest knight would tremble at such a scene. This servant was not the previous personal servant of Duke Gaston. To be precise, since he came to Blois, he has had 4 personal servants in succession, and each of them either fell seriously ill and died suddenly for unknown reasons, or encountered various accidents after leaving office. The one standing by the Duke's bed now is a brave gatekeeper. Since he can get a gold Louis here every day, he came bravely and has stayed until now. But there is another problem, that is, this kind of person is inevitably a little dull. For example, after he noticed that something was wrong with the Duke, he could only stand by the bed and scream. Fortunately, at this time, the bedroom of the Duke of Gaston's second wife, Madame Marguerite de Lorraine, whom he loved and relied on, was separated from the Duke's room by only a wall. When she heard the servant shouting, she quickly put on her cloak and rushed into the room. The whole process took less than a minute. Since the Duke became seriously ill, this lady has never taken off her outer clothes when she went to bed. She slapped the servant to stop shouting, and ordered her personal maid to bring hot water and cotton cloth. She also shouted to the servant who was awakened by her to wake up others, including the Duke's confessor, priest, doctor, and her and the Duke's 3 daughters. A few minutes later, hot water and cotton cloth arrived. The Duke's bedsheet had been torn away and thrown away, and rolled under the bed. The Duchess wrung the cotton cloth half dry from the copper basin and gently covered the Duke's face, slowly wiping away the dried blood. The black pudding-like blood clots had been wiped off with a bedsheet before. The Duke's terrible eyes were also closed by the Duchess, and a velvet mask was put on him so that people could not see his horrible appearance now, except for the pair of eyeballs that were about to fall out. There was also a swollen tongue and dents, bruises and blisters all over his cheeks and neck. In about half an hour, the confessor and priest, the doctor and the Duke's daughters all came. The oldest was 13 years old and the youngest was 10 years old. Originally, they had an 8-year-old brother and a 6-year-old sister, but they died 6 years ago and 2 years ago respectively. Now the Duke had no male heir, only an 18-year-old illegitimate son. Just by hearing his breathing, people could tell how much pain the Duke was in. His breathing was irregular, sometimes long, sometimes short, heavy like a blacksmith's bellows, shallow like a butterfly flapping its wings. His groans sounded like a ghoul coming from the soil 9 feet below, long and sad. Everyone who heard it would have a thought in their heart, that is, to let the groaning person die quickly and not let him continue to suffer such torture. But after the doctor, the strange man who always wore a crow's mouth mask and had a hunchback, gave the Duke a cup of potion that was like boiling mud, the Duke survived again. He held the Duchess's hand, and his thoughts were transmitted from this tightly clenched hand to the Duchess's heart. He was indeed suffering, but he did not want to die, at least not now. He had no male heirs. When he died, the only one who would inherit the territory and title would be Philip, the younger brother of King Louis of France. In other words, not only would he be defeated by his enemies, but everything he sought would become a delicacy in the mouths of his enemies. He could not accept this result anyway. But his serious illness was not just a disguise as people speculated. He was really sick and was on the verge of death. When the confessor and the priest realized that the Duke might not need them, they withdrew at the Duchess's signal. Before leaving the room, the confessor saw a set of triptychs hanging in the Duke's bedroom. What he saw made him cross himself. The Duchess gazed at the huge woodcut, a work from Flanders by Hieronymus Bosch, as wide as 3 men with their arms outstretched, and as high as a man. The strange and evil painter had used his most vicious imagination in this painting dedicated to a nunnery, although the subject was still a common religious theme. God handed Eve to Adam. There were worldly pleasures and hell pains. But starting from the Garden of Eden, God, Adam and Eve, many strange plants and animals appeared on the screen, such as huge flowers like buildings, thorny fruits that cracked open and stuck out tongues, winged fish and 3-headed birds, etc. The secular world was portrayed as a large garden full of young men and women who were naked and in ambiguous postures, and there were more mutated and distorted scenes, such as owls hatched from pomegranates with many legs, mermaids wearing iron helmets, and women riding cats. What was even more strange was that the skin color of those humans ranged from blue-gray to white, and from white to red, and then some were so black that their eyebrows, eyes and limbs could not be distinguished, and they looked like a human-shaped upright shadow. When the painter arrived in hell, his imagination was completely let loose. Here you can see animals ruling over humans. There is no fire or magma in hell, and there is no pain on the faces of humans, but they are clearly made into various furniture and musical instruments, either pierced, crushed, or carrying heavy objects, unable to stand up straight. The strange thing is that people say it is absurd, but they can't take their eyes off. When you look at them, it's like you can hear all kinds of sounds coming from the picture, from grumbling, crying to roaring, or begging. This painting should have been destroyed, but for some reason, the bishop of the convent collected it, and then the Duke of Gaston heard about it occasionally and insisted on going to see it, and then bought it for a high price of 1,000 livres. I'm honored that you like my humble work so much. The doctor saw that the Duchess was staring at him again, and he laughed. His laughter was like a frightened cat. Mr. Boss, Duke Gaston did not take off his mask, but he seemed to be able to see the picture through the dark black velvet. How long can I live? You should have died long ago, Hieronymus Boss, the guy who should have died 100 years ago but could still walk in the world as if nothing had happened, smiled and picked up something from the bedsheet that had not been thrown away, held it in front of the candle to show the Duke. Look, sir, this is your lung. Is there no hope? No. If I can have another son, the Duke whispered. He didn't have enough strength either. I can still sleep with women. My wife will arrange it for me, 10 or 20. There will always be a son in their belly. I will let Margaret recognize him. He will be my legal heir. That's impossible, Mr. Duke. You started to rot from the inside, which means that even if you can, get up now, Your two shriveled testicles can't produce seeds. You are destined to lose your territory and title, but it doesn't matter. By then you will be dead and buried underground, and you will no longer have any consciousness." These words made the Duke furious, but all he could do was to tear off his mask. Even so, he was still exhausted and panting. The Duchess held his head in her arms without any disgust and let him lie on her knees. Even though the Duke's head was like a rotten plum, after a moment of excitement, the Duke suddenly calmed down. He reached out and pushed his eyeballs to make them go back a little. Although he could hardly see what was in front of him now, as long as he still had a functioning mind, and he still had a loyal wife and subjects, he would. Then, he said calmly, "If I want someone to be buried with me." "Who?" "King Louis XIV of France." This answer made Mr. Boss silent for a while, and then he asked, "Repay all the money I left behind, and 100 blank identity documents. Where's your wife?" "She has her own dowry." "Where are your daughters?" "They are all engaged and have their own dowries." Here, Duke Gaston did not mention his eldest daughter, the Duchess of Montpensier. If the Duchess of Montpensier left Duke Gaston with the impression of an incompetent waste and a mean betrayer before she returned to the court, then after she used the income from her territory to exchange for the king's forgiveness of her instead of her father, she became Duke Gaston's out-and-out enemy. He did not let her die, not out of his father's kindness, but because the power the Duke now holds is very meager and needs to be used in the most critical places. "What about your son?" "He is my only bloodline. I will send him to Spain." "Then what about Philip, Duke of Anjou?" "I want to leave a Bourbon king for France, and if I make such a request, you will never agree." "Indeed, Mr. Duke," said Boss, taking off his mask, revealing red eyes and sharp fangs, "but we have promised Prince Theodoric of Anjou that we will never harm anyone in the royal family, so I can only regretfully act as an intermediary for you. My reward should be able to impress many people." "Indeed, and that Majesty," said Boss, "has indeed done some things that have displeased many people recently." Chapter 100 Dunkirk Entry Ceremony 1. Dunkirk is a port city, as everyone knows. It is connected to the sea by wide canals and water channels. Its roads are paved with small stones and there are water channels on both sides of the road. Because seawater can be introduced for washing, it is cleaner than other cities in France. However, no matter how clean it is, the smell in the city is always quite unsatisfactory. We have said before that Dunkirk is like a helpless virgin, being robbed by robbers, and its ownership is always changing. Therefore, there are no pure French, Flemish, Spanish or British people here. People here don't care who they are. In short, whoever occupies this place is their master, especially those who have nothing. Among them, there are even some mercenaries who have taken off their shoulder straps and discarded their weapons. They crowded on both sides of the road, waiting excitedly, because whether it is the king, the bishop or the marshal, when they first step into this place, there must be a glorious entry ceremony, and at the ceremony, they will throw coins in exchange for people's cheers and submission. This was the first entry ceremony experienced by the young king. Louis naturally wanted it to be as perfect as possible, but he was also reluctant to spend money to show his generosity. However, the bishop insisted that this ceremony was a way to demonstrate national strength, just like the banquets and balls they had held in Paris before, so it was indispensable. The Viscount of Turin, a general, also agreed. So they discussed for a long time about the ratio of gold, silver and copper coins in the coins. In contrast, the bishop was not worried about the pensions and subsequent medical expenses of the soldiers that the king was worried about. You know, until the death of Louis XIV, there were still veterans of the War of the Three Henrys, Note 1, who came to the bishop to ask for the overdue salaries. But everything in the world always has a give and take. Before the war, the bishop intended to hand over his intelligence network to the king. Of course, the king could not be stubborn on these issues. After they determined that the ratio of gold, silver and copper would be arranged at 1:10,000, Louis changed his mind and asked the bishop, in addition to the bishop, Viscount Turin and his confessor Abbot Le Riviere, who were indispensable figures, and the musketeers, could he arrange some brave soldiers in this battle to follow behind their ranks? This was not in line with tradition. The bishop hesitated for a while, but thought that there were not many people coming to the court this time. After removing Viscount Turin and some priests headed by himself, the remaining people were not of high status. In this case, he glanced at Viscount Turin, who started as an ordinary soldier in his uncle's army. Of course, he also understood the soldiers' ideas, and he immediately agreed. Then they argued about whether the king should enter Dunkirk on horseback or in a carriage, whether he should accept the key from the mayor in the square or in the city hall, whether Marshal Don Juan of Spain would be qualified to sit below the king at the subsequent banquet, and whether Prince of Condé should appear, etc. Until dusk, the king was not so concerned about the second question. He wanted to ride a horse, but the bishop and Mr. Tyrrell both thought he should take a carriage. From a safety point of view, a carriage is indeed safer than horseback. At this time, Louis was thinking about those soldiers. He remembered the red uniforms of the new model army, which were indeed very beautiful. Then he remembered the mottled and chaotic clothes of the French soldiers. The French army at that time did not provide uniforms. From uniforms to some equipment, the soldiers needed to prepare them themselves. Some guys who were good at planning were okay, some people who couldn't think of anything until the time came, or those who were short of money for various reasons could only take whatever was cheap, and some were cheated by hateful businessmen, so it was difficult to blame them. The king asked Bontemps to call Colbert, and then asked Colbert if he could prepare a set of identical clothes for the 24 soldiers in the next few days, that is, before the entry ceremony. At that time, the common people were used to wearing shirts, coats, trousers, socks and shoes. The nobles were similar, with the difference being the texture and decoration of the clothes, as well as some minor modifications, such as large sleeves, lace on the cuffs and collars, and embroidered garters, etc. However, these were not what Louis wanted to see in his soldiers. He needed warriors rather than actors or musicians. He made his request to Colbert. Of course, as always, although it was difficult, the minister who was a businessman agreed without hesitation. He was now managing the private finances of Cardinal Mazarin. Although some people laughed at him for being exiled to the bishop by the king, Colbert knew very well that when he stood beside the bishop, he was closer to the king than before. After all, there was a robed nobleman above him at that time, Nicolas Fouquet, who was a procurator. Mr. Fouquet was jealous and hateful of Colbert, because the king's repeated actions were undoubtedly comparing them. Although Fouquet took the lead with his status, Colbert was always a huge threat. Colbert knew that Fouquet had slandered the king several times, saying that he had surrendered to the bishop, and that he was a spy for the king. If the relationship between the king and the bishop was not as stiff as outsiders thought, he might have become a victim of the struggle between the two powers. But Colbert also knew that the king's favor to him was almost entirely based on his understanding of the king's will and his dedication. If he was a little slack, or had any ulterior motives, just once, or even just failed to complete the work assigned by the king, he would be waiting for the guillotine or the gallows. His king was kind, but he was never soft-hearted to those who disappointed him. So every time he worked for the king, Colbert would throw himself into it with a terrifying enthusiasm, and this time was no exception. That night, he found the thick and crisp satin in dark blue and silver, white linen and gold silk ribbons, and beautiful calfskin-heeled boots that met the king's requirements from the familiar merchants who accompanied him. After that, he asked all the tailors he could recruit to work day and night to make the clothes. On one side were the jingling silver crowns, and on the other side were prisons and whips. Anyone with a little bit of common sense would know what to choose. Fortunately, the king required that the soldiers' clothes should focus on quality rather than decoration, so they reduced the production of a lot of lace and decorative ribbons. After the finished product came out, Captain Sebastian Vauban became the first person to try it on. He held his head high and appeared in front of everyone with a proud look on his face, like a gorgeous pheasant. The king had tried to reduce the use of colors, but people at that time would consider simplicity a shame. If the king really used gray, grass green or brown as the main color of military uniforms in the next few hundred years, I am afraid that the recruitment work would encounter great resistance. So what was presented to people was a dark blue satin short coat, fluffy pants and knee-length black boots, covered with a silver long coat, with a gold-rimmed cross embroidered on the chest, and a bright red shoulder strap across from the shoulder to the waist, plus silver buttons and gold pins, and a wide-brimmed hat decorated with ostrich feathers, which made people full of desire, at least for the selected soldiers. This set of clothes was given to them by the king. When the 24 people were dressed neatly, carrying muskets and wearing long swords, standing behind Viscount Tyrrell, even the bishop could not help but nod slightly. And in this town with only 3,000 people, as the bishop said, any stranger would attract attention, but what if it was not a stranger? Few people would pay attention to a woman who took shelter in a monastery, especially because she was bloated and old. Or rather, People paid more attention to her fat body and bloated face. As for other things, such as the color of her hair and eyes that were always hidden under her headscarf, who could remember? She didn't even have a lover. The priests hired her because she had donated money to the monastery before and because she could save them a lot of trouble. They were originally very absurd, but the demon incident in Loudon 15 years ago, Father Grandy was pointed out as the devil's spokesperson by a female abbess there, because before that, his romantic affairs brought him many enemies, so after several repetitions, the priest was burned to death after suffering countless tortures. This made the French priests involuntarily become dignified. It was this old woman who had almost no contact with anyone except the priest's orders. There was such an old woman who lived in seclusion in many places. After seeing the king's soldiers marching majestically through the streets of the town, she returned to her little house, closed the door, lit the candle ends given to her by the priests, and then, with a relaxed posture that was completely inconsistent with her apparent age, she raised her legs, lifted her skirt, pulled out a silver-plated dagger from inside, and used it to illuminate herself. She first pulled out the cotton stuffed in her cheeks, and then used the lining soaked in strong liquor to wipe off the powder on her face, charcoal powder and oatmeal powder. The mixture will make the face black, yellow and rough. She smiled at herself in the mirror, put the dagger back to its original place, and began to untie her coat. Under the coat that was almost bursting, there were pieces of bread. She took them out and took a bite, put them in a basket, and slowly took off her petticoat. It might be hard for anyone to imagine that there was such a beautiful figure under the loose petticoat. Unfortunately, no one could see it. She took out new silk underwear, dark red cotton outer skirt, and a lace hat from the suitcase. In short, it was something that a girl with a little wealth could afford. It was dark at this time, and there were fewer people on the street. She carried the basket and walked towards the camp of the guards. Note 1, War of the Three Henrys, 1587 to 1589. The last religious war in France in the late 16th century, between the moderate but deviant King Henry III, the extreme Catholic, the third Duke of Guise, Henry I of Lorraine, and the Huguenot leader, King of Navarre and presumptive heir to the French throne, Henry of Bourbon, later Henry IV, founder of the Bourbon dynasty of France. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.